Off the coasts of Japan, beneath water that now feels permanent, there are shapes that don't quite belong to the sea. Stone patterns, submerged terraces, traces that some believe may reach back to the Jōmon era, long before the shoreline looked the way it does today. Tonight we'll drift through the idea of submerged palaces of ancient Japan, exploring the changing coastlines, the archaeological interpretations, and the quieter question of how rising waters may have reshaped entire communities over time. Here on Made for Sleep, this is a carefully researched and thoughtfully assembled historical experience, shaped by our team using available studies, interpretations, and historical context, shared slowly so you can simply listen and unwind. Let the rain settle softly around you, and if you're still awake, feel free to share how you're doing and what hour the night has reached where you are. Tonight, we're descending beneath the waves of southern Japan, where stone formations rest in dim green light, and archaeologists still argue about what human hands may have shaped thousands of years ago. The Jōmon people lived along these coasts for over 10,000 years, and when the ice sheets melted, the ocean crept inland and covered their world. What remains below is fragmentary, disputed, and strange. The water here moves differently than you expect. You're floating just beneath the surface off the coast of Yonaguni Island, southernmost point of Japan's inhabited territory, where the current runs warm and the visibility shifts between crystalline and murky, depending on what the tide decides to carry. The stone beneath you appears in sections, flat plains that might be natural, might be worked, might be something between the two. Archaeologists have been visiting this site since the mid-1990s, and they still haven't agreed on what they're looking at. Your mask fogs slightly, you clear it without thinking, a motion practiced enough to feel automatic, and when your vision sharpens again, the rock face below shows what could be a corner. Right angles don't form often in nature, but they do form. The ocean has been reshaping this coastline for 12,000 years, ever since the last ice age ended and sea levels began their slow, relentless climb. What was once dry land is now 25 meters underwater, and the Jōmon people who might have walked here left no written records to say whether they carved these stones or simply camped near them. The term Jōmon means cord-marked, named for the rope patterns they pressed into wet clay before firing it. It's a practical name for a culture that lasted longer than most civilizations we consider ancient. From roughly 14,000 BCE to 300 BCE, communities across the Japanese archipelago made pottery, gathered shellfish, hunted deer, collected nuts, and lived in ways that archaeology is still working to fully understand. They weren't a single unified culture, more like a long, evolving tradition of lifeways adapted to islands that were, for much of that period, connected to the Asian mainland by land bridges that no longer exist. You drift lower. A school of small fish moves past, uninterested in your presence, and you follow them without meaning to. The stone here shows striations, lines running horizontally across what might be a terrace. Natural erosion can do this, so can purposeful carving. The debate hinges on measurements, angles, tool marks that may or may not be there, and the uncomfortable fact that if this structure is human-made, it predates most of what we know about monumental construction in Japan by several thousand years. The name palace gets attached to sites like this by journalists and documentary producers looking for a handle the public will grab onto. Palaces suggest royalty, hierarchy, centralized power, all things the Jōmon people seem to have mostly avoided. Their settlements were small, their social structures appear relatively egalitarian, and their material culture focused on objects of daily use rather than displays of wealth. If they built anything monumental, it would be the exception rather than the rule, which is part of why the Yonaguni monument remains so contentious. The water grows colder as you descend. Temperature layers in the ocean don't announce themselves. You simply pass through a boundary and suddenly the warmth is gone. The stone formation extends deeper than you expected, stepped in a way that could be erosion along existing fault lines, or could be something else entirely. Marine geologist Masaki Kimura has argued for decades that this is a human structure, possibly a ceremonial site, possibly a quarry, possibly both. Other researchers look at the same formations and see natural geology shaped by wave action and tectonic movement. Both groups bring measurements, photographs, and expert analysis. Both groups remain convinced. You pause at what looks like a groove, a channel cut into the stone that runs straight for several meters before disappearing into sediment. Tool marks would settle this, but the rock has been underwater for millennia, encrusted with algae and coral, scoured by currents. If there were chisel marks, they're gone now. What remains is suggestive without being conclusive, which is possibly the most frustrating kind of archaeological evidence. Above you, the surface shimmers. Light refracts through the water in shifting columns, illuminating particles of plankton and suspended sediment that drift like slow snow. The Jōmon people who lived on these islands during the early Holocene, the geological epoch we're still in, would have known a very different coastline. The Yonaguni area was part of a larger landmass, connected to what is now Taiwan and mainland Asia. You could have walked from here to places that are now deep ocean. The flooding happened gradually, not in a single catastrophic event, but the result was the same. Entire landscapes submerged, forests drowned, settlements abandoned as the water crept higher season after season. Pottery shards from Jōmon sites show us what they ate. Residue analysis reveals salmon, deer, wild boar, chestnuts, acorns, and an astonishing variety of shellfish. They weren't farmers. Agriculture came later, imported from the continent along with new populations and new ways of organizing society. The Jōmon were hunter-gatherers, but that term undersells their sophistication. They managed forests, encouraged useful plant growth, and returned to the same seasonal camps for generations. Their pottery is among the oldest in the world, predating ceramics from the Middle East by several thousand years, decorated with elaborate patterns that seem to have held cultural significance we can only guess at. You surface for a moment, clearing your regulator and breathing the salt air. The island of Yonaguni rises behind you, green and steep, populated by more horses than people. The modern town sits on the northern coast, a small cluster of buildings and fishing boats. To the west, nothing but ocean until Taiwan. To the south, nothing but ocean until the Philippines. The isolation is profound, and it's easy to imagine how communities here would have developed their own traditions, their own relationship with the sea, their own ways of understanding stone and water and the boundary between them. Descending again, you follow the formation's southern edge, where the rock drops away into deeper water. The visibility here is worse. Sediment stirred by bottom currents hangs in the water like fog. You move slowly, one hand trailing along the stone to keep your orientation. The surface shows pitting that could be natural weathering or could be the result of repeated human impact. Quarrying stone is loud, dusty, dangerous work, but it leaves distinctive marks, organised fracture patterns, extraction points where blocks were removed, tool scars along the working face. If this was a quarry, those signs should be everywhere. Instead, you find patterns that suggest regularity without quite confirming it. The academic debate around the Yonaguni monument has become something of a cautionary tale about confirmation bias and the challenges of underwater archaeology. Sites submerged for this long are difficult to study. Equipment is expensive, dive time is limited, and the environment actively works against preservation. Add in the fact that Yonaguni sits in an active seismic zone, subjected to earthquakes and tsunamis that can reshape underwater formations in minutes, and you have a site that might have looked very different 1,000 years ago than it does today. Still, there's something here. Even the skeptics agree on that. Whether it's human-made or not, the formation is unusual enough to warrant study, and the debate has pushed forward our understanding of what sea level rise did to early coastal populations throughout this region. We know now that vast areas of what was once habitable land are underwater. We know the flooding was gradual enough that people could have adapted, moving inland as the ocean rose, abandoning settlements that became tidal zones and then submarine ruins. We know that much of the archaeological record from this period is inaccessible, buried under meters of water and sediment, and that what we understand about Jōmon culture comes from inland sites that represent only a fraction of where these people actually lived. You find another corner, this one more pronounced. The angle is close to 90 degrees, and the two faces meet in a clean line that runs for several meters before breaking off into rubble. Natural geological processes can create right angles. Columnar basalt does it regularly, but this isn't basalt. This is sandstone, a sedimentary rock that forms in layers and erodes in predictable ways, usually rounded rather than angular. The sharp edge nags at you, and you take photographs from multiple angles, knowing they'll be added to the hundreds of others already documenting this site, each one used to support whichever interpretation the photographer favours. The cold is starting to penetrate your wetsuit. You check your gauges and find you have another 15 minutes at this depth before needing to begin your ascent. The current has picked up slightly, pushing you eastward along the formation, and you let it carry you toward a section that looks like steps. They're irregular, each one a different height, some barely distinguishable from the ones above or below, but they descend in a sequence that's hard to explain as purely erosional. Water doesn't carve steps. It carves slopes, channels, and smooth curves. Steps require intent, or at least a very specific set of geological conditions that haven't been convincingly demonstrated here. On the other hand, if these are human-made, they're crude. Jōmon construction, at least what we know of it from terrestrial sites, was sophisticated in its own way. They built pit houses with carefully shaped wooden frames, created stone circles that required moving massive blocks, and produced pottery with technical precision that suggests deep knowledge of firing temperatures and clay composition. If they were going to carve monumental stone structures, you'd expect to see that same precision, not these rough, irregular surfaces. Unless, of course, this was never finished, or it served a different purpose than we're imagining, or it's been so heavily modified by millennia of erosion that the original form is unrecognizable. Archaeology often presents more questions than answers, and underwater archaeology doubles that problem. You ascend slowly, following the step-like formation upward toward shallower water. Light increases as you rise, the deep blue-green giving way to something brighter, almost turquoise where the sun penetrates fully. Small fish have returned, darting between coral outcrops that have colonized the upper sections of rock. Life adapts quickly to new environments, and what was once possibly a dry land construction site is now a thriving marine habitat. The ocean doesn't care about human history. It simply fills available space and gets on with the business of being an ocean. Near the top of the formation, maybe 8 meters below the surface, you find what looks like a post hole, a circular depression carved into the rock, just the right size to hold a wooden support beam. Or it could be a natural pothole, worn smooth by rocks tumbling in the current. The problem with this kind of evidence is that both explanations are plausible, and without additional context, without finding the actual post, or tool marks around the hole's rim, or a pattern of similar holes suggesting a structure, it remains ambiguous. You surface again, this time staying up. The dive is over, and you swim back toward the boat thinking about what you saw, and what it means, and whether either of those questions can be satisfactorily answered with current methods. The Yonaguni monument will still be there tomorrow, and next year, and a century from now, gradually eroding and changing and refusing to provide a clear answer about its origins. Back on the boat, you remove your gear and accept a towel from the dive operator, who has seen 1,000 tourists come here looking for proof of ancient civilizations, and who remains diplomatically neutral about the whole thing. He knows the rock formations can guide you to each major feature, and will cheerfully explain both the human-made theory and the natural formation theory without committing to either. It's a sensible position. The evidence doesn't support certainty. The Jōmon people, if they did create something here, left no oral tradition about it that survived. Writing came to Japan with Buddhism and Chinese cultural influence, more than 1,000 years after the Jōmon period ended. Stories may have persisted for a time, passed down through generations, but the cultural disruption of the Yayoi period, when agricultural societies replaced hunter-gatherer ones, likely severed many of those continuities. What the Jōmon knew about their own past is lost to us now, surviving only in the objects they made and the sites they left behind. You dry off as the boat returns to harbour, watching the coastline pass. Yonaguni is beautiful in a stark way, all volcanic rock and windswept vegetation, shaped by typhoons that blow through regularly enough to be part of the island's identity. Living here requires adapting to isolation, to weather, to the sea's moods. The Jōmon people were experts at adaptation. They inhabited nearly every environment the Japanese archipelago offered. Coastal areas, mountain valleys, river plains, islands both large and small, and developed regional variations in their culture that persisted across millennia. They were not primitive, despite what older textbooks suggested. They were sophisticated, just in ways that don't always leave obvious archaeological signatures. The harbour at Yonaguni is small, protected by a concrete breakwater that creates a calm basin for fishing boats. You disembark and walk through the town, past houses with traditional tile roofs and walls designed to withstand strong winds. An old woman tends a garden of sweet potatoes and bitter melon, and she nods as you pass. Life here continues in patterns not so different from how it might have been 1,000 years ago, minus the modern conveniences. Fishing, farming, coping with storms, finding meaning in routines dictated by season and sea. That night, lying in a small guest house with windows open to catch the breeze, you think about rising water and what it takes from us. Not dramatically. The Jōmon didn't flee from catastrophic floods in a single generation. They simply moved a little higher each year, abandoning coastal camps when they became marshy, relocating to ground that stayed dry. Over generations, the sea claimed vast territories, and with them went middens full of discarded shells, hearths where families gathered, and whatever structures they might have built in wood and stone. Most of it is gone now, buried under sediment or destroyed by time. The Oniguni monument, whatever it is, remains because it's rock. Everything else rotted or washed away. Sleep comes slowly, your mind still half submerged in that blue-green world where nothing is certain, and the past exists in fragments too worn to read clearly. The sound of waves against the breakwater provides a rhythm steady and patient, the same sound that has marked nights on this island for as long as humans have lived here. Somewhere beneath those waves, stone formations wait, neither confirming nor denying their origins, simply existing in the cold and the dark and the slow passage of currents that have forgotten more about the early Holocene than we'll ever know. Morning brings you to a different site, this one on land but no less mysterious. The Sanai Maruyama settlement in Aomori Prefecture, northern Honshu, is the largest Jōmon site yet discovered, and it changes assumptions. For decades, archaeologists believed the Jōmon lived in small temporary camps, never developing the kind of large-scale settlements associated with complex societies. Then they excavated Sanai Maruyama and found evidence of a community that housed several hundred people year-round for nearly 2,000 years, from about 3,900 BCE to 2,300 BCE. The reconstructed buildings stand in a park now, modern reproductions based on post holes and carbonized remains. The largest structure is massive, 10 meters wide, 30 meters long, with 6 enormous chestnut pillars supporting a roof that would have covered communal space for gatherings, ceremonies, or work that required shelter from rain. The pillars are impressive, each one a meter in diameter, sunk deep into the earth to create a stable foundation. The Jōmon people who built this knew engineering, understood load distribution and structural integrity, and committed significant labour to creating something meant to last. You walk through the reconstructed village slowly, trying to imagine it inhabited. Smoke rising from hearths, children running between buildings, the smell of cooking fish and roasting chestnuts, the sound of stone tools being sharpened for the next hunt. Archaeological evidence shows they made elaborate pottery here, some pieces purely decorative with flame-like projections rising from the rim. They carved jade into ornaments, created lacquerware. Yes, lacquer, which requires specific tree sap and careful processing, and participated in trade networks that brought obsidian from distant sources. This was not a simple lifestyle. This was a culture with art, craft traditions, and enough social organisation to maintain a large settlement across generations. The burial sites reveal more. Unlike many agricultural societies that developed clear status hierarchies reflected in grave goods, Jōmon burials at Sanai Maruyama show relatively equal treatment. People were buried in the same general area, usually in flex positions, sometimes with grave goods but not in quantities that suggest vast wealth disparities. There are exceptions. Some burials include large numbers of jade ornaments or ceremonial objects, but they're rare enough to suggest these might have been ritual specialists rather than hereditary elites. The Jōmon seem to have been functionally egalitarian, at least in death, which may reflect their social organisation in life. Near the centre of the reconstructed village stands the most enigmatic feature. 6 large post holes arranged in a perfect line, spaced exactly 4.2 metres apart, each hole about 2 metres deep. The reconstructed pillars rise from these holes, massive wooden columns that serve no obvious structural purpose. They don't support a roof. There's no evidence of crossbeams or a building associated with them. They simply stand in a row, monumental and inexplicable. Theories range from astronomical observatory to ceremonial marker to something we lack the cultural context to understand. The precision of their placement argues for careful planning and intent, but what that intent was remains unknown. You sit on a bench near the pillars, watching other visitors take photographs and read informational plaques. A school group arrives, elementary students in matching hats, and their teacher explains that these ancient people made pottery before almost anyone else in the world. The children seem unimpressed, which is fair. Pottery is a hard sell when you're 9 years old and would rather be literally anywhere else. One child asks if the Jōmon had swords, and when the teacher says no, the child's interest visibly evaporates. It's a reminder that our fascination with the past is selective. We gravitate toward conflict, drama, the rise and fall of empires. The Jōmon don't fit that narrative. They didn't build cities in the traditional sense, didn't create written histories, didn't expand through military conquest. They made beautiful objects, lived sustainably in their environment for over 10,000 years, and then gradually gave way to agricultural populations with different ways of organizing society. It's not the kind of story that gets turned into epic films, but it's a remarkable achievement in its own right. The park includes a museum, climate-controlled and modern, where actual Jōmon artifacts are displayed behind glass. You move through the exhibits slowly, studying pottery fragments that show intricate chord patterns, clay figurines with exaggerated features that might be fertility symbols or might be something else entirely, and stone tools shaped for specific purposes. Scrapers, blades, grinding stones, each one showing the wear patterns of actual use. These weren't made for burial. They were used in daily life, then discarded or lost, and they survived long enough for us to find them and wonder about the hands that shaped them. One display case holds something remarkable: carbonized textiles. Fabric rarely survives in archaeological contexts. It decays too quickly. But under the right conditions, usually involving fire or waterlogging, fibers can persist. These fragments show a plain weave pattern, simple but effective, proof that the Jōmon made cloth as well as cordage. They probably wove baskets, mats and fishing nets too, none of which survived, but the techniques would have been similar. Basketry is in many ways more fundamental than pottery, lighter, faster to make, and just as useful for storage and transport. The Jōmon pottery might be famous, but they were likely working with plant fibers long before they started shaping clay. Outside, the reconstructed pit houses offer a glimpse of domestic life. They're semi-subterranean, with the floor dug about a metre below ground level and a thatched roof rising above. The design is practical for this climate. Cooler in summer, easier to heat in winter, and stable against the winds that come off the ocean. Inside, a central hearth provides light and warmth, and the space is surprisingly comfortable, larger than you expected. A family could live here reasonably well, with storage areas around the perimeter and sleeping platforms arranged around the fire. The hearthstones show burn marks from the demonstration fires. The park staff light occasionally, and you imagine the real thing: a low fire burning from evening until morning, coals banked overnight and stirred back to life at dawn. The smoke would have found its way out through the thatch, slowly blackening the interior roof beams but also treating the wood, making it more resistant to insects and rot. It's the kind of solution that emerges from generations of trial and error, knowledge accumulated and passed down not through writing but through demonstration and practice. You leave Sanai Maruyama thinking about continuity and change. The Jōmon way of life persisted for an astonishing span of time, longer than recorded history, longer than most civilizations we study. And then it ended. Not through conquest or collapse, but through gradual replacement as new populations brought rice agriculture and new social structures. Some Jōmon likely intermarried with the newcomers, contributing genetic and cultural elements to what became Japanese culture. Others may have resisted, moving to more marginal areas where the old ways could continue a while longer, but eventually the hunter-gatherer lifestyle became untenable in the face of agricultural expansion, and the Jōmon period ended. What survives are fragments, pottery shards, stone tools, shell middens, and the rare sites like Sanai Maruyama, where preservation was good enough to reveal larger patterns. And, possibly, stone structures now underwater, if that's what they are. The uncertainty is frustrating, but also appropriate. The deep past doesn't owe us clarity. It exists in pieces, partial and eroded, and we assemble what we can from what remains. You travel south again, this time to the Okinawa Trough, where other submerged sites have been reported. These are less famous than Yonaguni, less contentious, but equally fascinating. Underwater surveys have revealed what appear to be stone circles, arrangements too regular to be natural, sitting in water 30 meters deep. If they're human-made, they date to the early Holocene at the latest, before sea levels rose to their current height. If they're natural, they're curious geological formations worth studying for their own sake. The dive here is different. The water is warmer, visibility better, and the seafloor is sandy rather than rocky. The stone circle appears gradually as you descend, first as dark shapes against pale sand, then resolving into individual stones arranged in an approximate oval. They're not large. Each stone is maybe half a metre tall, partially buried, but their arrangement suggests intention. Stones don't naturally form circles. They roll downhill, settle in depressions, cluster in random patterns shaped by water movement and gravity. Circles require someone to place them deliberately, but proving that is difficult. The stones show no tool marks, no obvious signs of shaping, nothing that clearly distinguishes them from naturally occurring rocks that happen to be arranged in a suggestive pattern. You swim the perimeter, counting stones, 16 in total, and noting that they're all roughly the same size and composition. That consistency is interesting. If they were deposited by natural processes, you'd expect more variation. If they were selected and placed by humans, the uniformity makes sense. One stone is tipped over, its base exposed above the sand. You examine it carefully and find nothing conclusive. The bottom is weathered smooth, which could mean it sat upright for a long time before falling, or could mean it was rolled here by currents and eventually settled in this position. Both explanations work. Neither proves anything. Above you, a manta ray glides past, utterly indifferent to your presence. It moves with minimal effort, wings rippling in slow undulations, and you watch it until it fades into the blue distance. The ocean is full of life that has no connection to human history, no concern for our questions about who built what and when. The ray doesn't care if these stones were placed by Jōmon hands or arranged by chance. It's simply passing through, hunting for plankton, existing in a world where the past is irrelevant. You surface and float on your back, looking up at clouds moving slowly across a pale sky. The boat is anchored nearby, its engine quiet, and the only sound is water lapping against your wetsuit and the distant cry of seabirds. This is what the Jōmon might have heard on calm days, assuming they came to the coast here, assuming they knew this place before it flooded. The birds would have been the same species. Evolution moves slower than sea level rise, and the sound of waves would have been similar, just striking a shoreline that's now far above your head. The question that keeps surfacing is why. If the Jōmon did create stone circles or carved structures or any of the underwater features attributed to them, what was the purpose? Ceremonial sites are the default explanation when we don't understand something, a catch-all category for constructions that don't fit obvious practical functions. But ceremony is important to human societies. It reinforces social bonds, marks significant events, provides structure to time and meaning to place. The Jōmon burial practices suggest they had ritual beliefs, and the elaborate pottery found at sites like Sanai Maruyama often shows features that go beyond pure utility. Handles shaped like animals, flame-like projections, patterns that must have held significance beyond decoration. Stone circles, if that's what these are, could have marked seasonal gathering points, places where different bands met to trade, share information, arrange marriages. They could have been calendrical markers, aligned with solstices or equinoxes to track the year. They could have been territorial boundaries, navigation aids, or memorials to important events or people. Or they could have served purposes we can't reconstruct, because the cultural context is lost. Their meaning dependent on beliefs and stories that didn't survive the transition to agricultural societies and eventually to writing. The boat operator signals that it's time to return, and you swim back slowly, reluctant to leave. There's something peaceful about floating above ambiguous stones in warm water, suspending judgment and simply experiencing the strangeness of it. The need to categorize, to solve, to determine with certainty whether something is human-made or natural, that need doesn't go away, but it can be set aside temporarily. What remains is the experience of being here, in water that once was air, above land that once supported forests and camps and lives we can barely imagine. The return trip takes an hour, following the coast northward past small islands and rocky promontories that haven't changed much since the Jōmon period. The boat's engine settles into a steady rhythm, and you drift mentally, thinking about time and change and the sheer duration of the Jōmon period. 14,000 years. For context, all of recorded history, from the first Sumerian cuneiform to now, spans only about 5,000 years. The Jōmon existed 3 times that long, their culture evolving slowly across millennia, while maintaining core elements that we can recognize in the archaeological record. They witnessed climate changes we can barely comprehend. They lived through the warming that ended the Ice Age, watched sea levels rise and coastlines retreat, adapted to new environments as forest replaced tundra, and new species moved into the archipelago. They developed pottery during a period when most human populations worldwide were still exclusively using containers made from organic materials that left no trace. They built substantial structures, created art, maintained long-distance trade networks, and lived in ways that left relatively light footprints on the landscape. And then rice came. Introduced from the Korean peninsula around 900 BCE, rice agriculture transformed Japanese society within a few centuries. It required different land management, supported higher population densities, and encouraged social hierarchies that the Jōmon seem to have avoided. The Yayoi culture that emerged alongside rice farming eventually displaced or absorbed the Jōmon populations, and by 300 BCE, the old way of life was effectively over except in the far north of Honshu and in Hokkaido, where the Ainu people maintained hunter-gatherer traditions much longer. The boat docks at a small port town where fishing nets are spread on the quay to dry and the smell of grilling fish comes from nearby restaurants. You thank the operator and walk into town, looking for food and finding a small shop that serves sashimi and miso soup. The fish is extraordinary. Tuna so fresh it still has the faint warmth of life, sliced thick, and served with nothing but soy sauce and wasabi. You eat slowly, appreciating the simplicity and quality, thinking that the Jōmon would have eaten fish in this same area, though probably not raw. They cooked in pottery vessels, boiling or steaming their catch, and the lack of elaborate preparation doesn't mean the food wasn't good. Simple methods work when the ingredients are excellent. Outside, the sun is setting, turning the water pink and gold. Fishing boats return to harbour one by one, their holds full of the day's catch, and there's a rhythm to the activity that feels timeless, even though the boats are modern and the nets are synthetic. Humans have been fishing these waters for thousands of years, using different technology but engaged in the same fundamental activity, taking food from the sea and bringing it to shore to be cleaned, cooked and consumed. You walk along the harbour wall watching the last light fade from the sky. Stars begin to appear, first one, then a handful, then too many to count. The Jōmon would have known these stars, would have used them for navigation when travelling along the coast in dugout canoes we know they made because fragments have been found in waterlogged sites. They would have told stories about the constellations, stories that didn't survive the cultural transitions, but would have been just as rich and meaningful as the myths that did get written down eventually. Night settles in completely, and the town lights create a soft glow against the darkness. You return to your lodging, a traditional inn with tatami mat floors and futon bedding that's surprisingly comfortable once you get used to it. The room is simple, just walls and floor and a low table, and the simplicity is restful. You lie down and listen to the sounds of the town settling for the night. Distant voices, a dog barking, the occasional car passing on the coastal road. Sleep comes easily, your mind finally quiet after days of diving and travelling and processing information. You dream of water rising slowly, so slowly that you don't notice at first. Trees become shorter as the flood continues, their crowns dropping below the surface until only branches show, then nothing. The land you're standing on shrinks to an island, then a shoal, then disappears entirely, and you're swimming in water that's warm and clear and seems to have no bottom. It's not frightening, just strange. A world transformed beyond recognition, where the familiar has been replaced by something alien but not hostile. You wake to grey morning light and the sound of rain on the roof. It's a soft rain, steady without being heavy, the kind that can last all day without becoming a storm. You dress and eat a simple breakfast, rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables, green tea, and then set out for the last site on your itinerary, the Torihama Shell Midden in Fukui Prefecture. Shell middens are among the most common Jōmon sites. Coastal communities ate enormous quantities of shellfish, and they discarded the shells in piles that grew over generations into substantial mounds. Torihama is particularly important because the site is waterlogged, which preserved organic materials that normally decay. Excavations have revealed wooden tools, woven baskets, cordage, and plant remains that give us direct evidence of what the Jōmon were doing on a daily basis. The site itself is unimpressive from the outside, just a grassy area with informational signs and a small protective structure over the excavation zone. But the museum attached to the site is excellent. displaying artifacts that change your understanding of what primitive means. There's a wooden comb carved from a single piece of wood with teeth so fine and regular that it must have taken hours to make. There's a woven basket in nearly perfect condition, its construction visible and elegant. There's a wooden paddle for a canoe, shaped to fit human hands, worn smooth by use. Most striking is a wooden bow found intact, still strung with what might be sinew or plant fibre cordage. It's small by modern standards, maybe 120 centimetres long, but perfectly functional, designed for hunting in forested environments where a longer bow would be cumbersome. The wood shows evidence of careful shaping, and the string attachment points are reinforced to prevent splitting. Someone made this bow with skill and knowledge, used it for hunting, and eventually lost or discarded it in a context where waterlogging prevented decay. Now it sits in a climate-controlled case, a direct connection to a person who lived 7,000 years ago and needed to hunt deer to feed their family. The plant remains reveal diet in detail. The Jōmon at Torihama ate chestnuts, walnuts, acorns, horse chestnuts, elderberries, grapes, raspberries, and water chestnuts. They collected lily bulbs, arrowroot, and yam. They harvested hemp for fibre, gourds for containers, and perilla for seeds that could be pressed for oil. This wasn't opportunistic foraging. This was detailed knowledge of which plants were edible, when they ripened, how to process them to remove toxins, and how to store them for winter consumption. The Jōmon were managing their environment in ways that encouraged useful species and discouraged less valuable ones, a practice sometimes called forest gardening that blurs the line between hunting, gathering, and agriculture. You spend hours in the museum, reading labels and studying artifacts until the information starts to blur together. Outside, the rain has stopped, leaving everything wet and shining. You walk to the actual midden site, which is partially excavated and covered to protect it from weather. The exposed section shows layers of shell compressed into a matrix that looks almost like concrete, except it's organic and porous and slowly decomposing despite preservation efforts. Each layer represents a discrete period of occupation, and the variations between layers tell us about changes in diet, climate, and available resources. Lower layers, older ones, contain mostly oyster and clam shells from species that prefer warm water. Upper layers show more cold water species, tracking climate fluctuations across centuries. There are also fish bones, deer bones, bird bones, and the occasional dog skeleton, because the Jōmon kept dogs for hunting and companionship, probably the first domesticated animal to reach the Japanese archipelago. A researcher is working nearby, carefully excavating a small section of midden and bagging samples for analysis. You watch for a while, appreciating the tedious precision of the work. Archaeology is not glamorous. It's slow, meticulous documentation of context and position, followed by laboratory analysis that can take months or years to produce results. The researcher acknowledges your presence with a nod but doesn't speak. Concentration is required when you're working at this scale, where moving one shell can destroy information about its relationship to neighbouring shells. You leave the site thinking about accumulation. The midden at Torihama built up over 2,000 years, shell by shell, meal by meal, generation after generation returning to this spot because it was productive and safe and familiar. That kind of continuity is rare in human history. Most sites get abandoned after a few centuries due to resource depletion, environmental change, or social conflict. But the Jōmon kept coming back, kept discarding their shells in the same place, kept living in ways that were sustainable enough to persist across millennia. The drive back to your lodging takes you along the coast, past small fishing villages and rice paddies that are bright green with new growth. The landscape is thoroughly modified by human activity. Terraced fields, concrete seawalls, roads carved into hillsides. But you can still see the bones of the original topography underneath. The mountains that rise inland are steep and forested, much as they would have been during the Jōmon period. The rivers that cut through the plains still follow ancient courses, though their banks are now reinforced and their flows regulated by dams upstream. It occurs to you that we're living through our own version of environmental transformation, one that future archaeologists might puzzle over the way we puzzle over Jōmon sites. Climate change is raising sea levels again, not as dramatically as the post-glacial flooding, but enough to threaten coastal cities. We're losing habitats, species, and ways of life at rates that will be visible in the stratigraphic record. The layer of sediment we're creating, filled with plastics, concrete, and industrial metals, will be unmistakable to whoever studies it in 10,000 years, assuming anyone is around to do the studying. The Jōmon survived massive environmental change by adapting gradually, moving with the changing conditions rather than trying to hold ground against them. We're less flexible, more invested in specific locations and infrastructure, and our population density makes migration difficult. What we can learn from the Jōmon is that long-term survival requires living within the productive capacity of your environment, and that sophistication doesn't always mean complexity. Sometimes it means knowing your place deeply enough to use it sustainably generation after generation. That evening, you return to the coast for one final dive, this time at a site called Kerama, a small cluster of islands west of Okinawa. The water here is absurdly clear, visibility extending 50 meters or more, and the coral reefs are among the healthiest in Japan. You descend along a reef wall that drops into deep water, following it down to 30 meters, where the light begins to dim and the colors shift toward blue and violet. Near the bottom of the wall you find what you're looking for, a stone formation that looks like a stacked structure. 3 flat stones balanced on top of each other in a way that seems unlikely to be natural. The stones are covered in coral and algae, colonized by marine life that has turned them into habitat, but underneath the biological growth, the shapes are still visible. They're rectangular, or approximately rectangular, and they're aligned in a way that suggests they were placed rather than tumbled. Or maybe you're seeing patterns that aren't there. The human brain is excellent at finding order in randomness, at interpreting ambiguous data in ways that support existing beliefs. You want these stones to be human-made because that would mean the Jōmon came here, built something, and left a trace of their presence in this beautiful place. But wanting something to be true doesn't make it so, and responsible archaeology requires skepticism even, especially when the evidence is suggestive. You photograph the formation from multiple angles, take measurements using a dive slate, and then simply float there for a while, watching fish move through the structure. A moray eel lives in a crevice between 2 stones, its head visible as it watches you with typical eel wariness. The eel doesn't care if these stones were placed by humans or deposited by a landslide. It has found a home here, and that's sufficient. Ascending slowly to allow nitrogen to dissipate from your tissues, you watch the coral reef pass by in layers. Shallow water corals give way to deeper species adapted to lower light levels, which in turn give way to sponges and sea fans in the deeper sections. The diversity is staggering, thousands of species interacting in ways we're still working to understand, and the reef as a whole is a living structure built by countless individual organisms over centuries. It's not so different from a midden, really, an accumulation of biological material that builds up over time, creating habitat for new generations. At the surface, you remove your regulator and breathe the warm evening air. The sun is low, casting long shadows across the water, and the islands around you are dark shapes against a sky that's transitioning from blue to orange to pink. This is what the Jōmon would have seen, this same light, this same ocean. The specific islands might have been different. Sea level was lower, so more land was exposed, but the quality of the evening light, the way it reflects off the water and illuminates the clouds, that would have been the same. You swim back to the boat thinking about endings. The Jōmon period ended, but the people didn't disappear. They were absorbed into new cultures, their genes and some of their traditions persisting, even as their distinctive way of life faded. The underwater sites, if they are sites, will eventually be destroyed by erosion and biological activity. The artifacts in museums will outlast them, preserved through active conservation, but even those will eventually decay. Everything is temporary on geological timescales. What persists is the fact that they were here, that they lived full lives in a world very different from ours, that they solved problems and created beauty and passed knowledge to their children who passed it to their children. The specifics may be lost, but the pattern remains, humans adapting to their environment, finding ways to thrive, and leaving traces that sometimes survive long enough for distant descendants to puzzle over. The boat returns to harbour as darkness settles in completely. Stars emerge in the gaps between clouds and the air cools to something comfortable. You disembark and walk through the small port town, past restaurants that are closing for the night and shops that are already shuttered. A cat crosses the street in front of you, unhurried, and disappears into an alley. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks twice and then goes quiet. Your lodging is nearby, a small room in a guest house run by an elderly couple, who speak minimal English and seem surprised that anyone wants to stay in their town. But they're gracious hosts, and they've left tea and small pastries in your room along with a handwritten note you can't quite decipher, but that seems welcoming. You drink the tea, eat the pastries, and lie down on the futon, exhausted in a pleasant way that comes from spending days in the water and the sun. Sleep comes quickly this time, with no dreams you can remember, just darkness and rest, and the faint sound of waves against the harbour wall, a sound that has marked nights in coastal towns across Japan for thousands of years, connecting the present to the deep past in a way that requires no artifacts or sites or academic debates. The ocean was here before humans arrived, and it will be here long after we're gone, moving according to tides and currents and rhythms that care nothing for our brief tenure on these islands. Morning arrives with sunlight and the smell of grilling fish from a nearby restaurant. You wake slowly, reluctant to leave the comfort of the futon, but eventually you rise and prepare for the day. This is your last morning in southern Japan. Tomorrow you return to normal life, to work and responsibilities, and a world very different from the one the Jōmon inhabited. But for today, you have a few more hours to spend thinking about the deep past and the questions it poses. You eat breakfast at the restaurant where the fish smell was coming from, ordering grilled mackerel and rice and miso soup. The mackerel is perfect, crispy skin, tender flesh, served with nothing but a wedge of lemon and some pickled radish. The simplicity of it feels appropriate after days of thinking about Jōmon foodways. They might have grilled fish over open fires, seasoning it with nothing but salt if they had access to it, and the result would have been just as satisfying as what you're eating now. After breakfast, you walk to a nearby beach, a small curve of sand backed by pine trees and rocks. The tide is out, exposing tide pools full of small crabs and anemones and shells. You crouch next to one pool and watch a hermit crab navigate around a sea urchin, its movements careful and deliberate. The urchin doesn't react. It has no reason to, the crab poses no threat. And after a moment, the crab continues on its way, scuttling toward a promising crevice in the rock. This is what the Jōmon would have seen when they came to the shore to gather shellfish. The same species of crabs, the same urchins, the same tide pools refilling with water as the ocean returns. The constancy of it is comforting, a reminder that some things persist despite all the changes humans introduce. Tide pools operated according to the same principles 12,000 years ago, and they'll operate according to those same principles 12,000 years from now, assuming the ocean still exists and tides still rise and fall. You sit on the beach for a long time, watching the water and thinking about nothing in particular. The morning is quiet. Few people come to this beach, and those who do are mostly older residents out for a walk or fishermen checking nets set overnight. A heron stands in the shallows, perfectly still, waiting for a fish to come within striking range. You watch it for 10 minutes, and in that time it doesn't move except for tiny adjustments to maintain balance as small waves pass. Then, in a motion almost too fast to see, the heron strikes, its beak stabbing into the water and emerging with a small fish. It swallows the fish in one gulp, adjusts its feathers, and returns to perfect stillness, waiting for the next opportunity. The efficiency of it is remarkable. No wasted motion, no unnecessary energy expenditure. The Jōmon would have admired that, would have tried to emulate it in their own hunting and fishing. Patience and precision, waiting for the right moment and then acting decisively. Eventually you stand and walk back toward town, your time here drawing to a close. You pass the harbour one last time, watching fishing boats being prepared for the afternoon's work. The nets are mended, the engines checked, the holds cleared of the previous day's catch. It's routine work, done the same way every day, and there's a satisfaction in watching people who know their craft perform it competently. Your final stop is a small shrine tucked into the hillside above town. It's not marked on any tourist maps, just a local place of worship, probably centuries old, maintained by the community through regular upkeep and occasional festivals. The shrine building is simple wood construction with a tiled roof, and the grounds are immaculately kept, swept clean of leaves and debris. You climb the stone steps slowly, pausing at the top to catch your breath and look back at the view. The town spreads below you, small and compact, surrounded by forest on 3 sides and ocean on the 4th. From here, you can see the entire harbour, the beach you visited this morning, and the islands dotting the ocean to the south. It's a landscape that has supported human life for millennia, and it looks like it could continue doing so for millennia more, assuming we don't destroy it through carelessness or greed. Inside the shrine, you pause at the offering box and drop in a few coins, not because you believe in the specific deities enshrined here, but because the gesture feels appropriate. This is a place where people have come to mark important moments, to ask for good fortune, to acknowledge forces beyond their control. The Jōmon had their own sacred places, we know from burial practices and the elaborate pottery found at certain sites, and while the specifics of their beliefs are lost, the impulse to recognize something larger than yourself is probably universal to human societies. You bow twice, clap twice, bow once more, following the standard Shinto practice even though you're not sure of its exact meaning. Then you turn and walk back down the steps, leaving the shrine to its quiet watch over the town and the sea. The journey home is long, multiple trains and a flight, hours of travel that compress the distance you've covered over the past week. You watch the landscape pass outside the train window, noting how quickly it changes from coastal to mountainous to urban. Japan is a small country by some measures, but it contains multitudes. Different climates, different ecosystems, different histories layered on top of each other like sediment in an archaeological site. By the time you reach home, it's late, and you're exhausted. You drop your bags and fall into bed, grateful for familiar surroundings and the comfort of your own pillow. Sleep comes immediately, deep and dreamless, your body recovering from days of diving and travel. In the morning, you'll return to normal life. Work will resume, routines will reassert themselves, and the questions about Jōmon underwater sites will fade into background noise. But something will persist, a sense of connection to the deep past, an awareness that the present is built on accumulated layers of previous presents, and that the people who lived thousands of years ago were not so different from us. They faced challenges, solved problems, created beauty, and tried to understand their place in a world that was often mysterious and sometimes hostile but always worth engaging with. The Jōmon left us fragments, pottery shards, stone tools, shell middens, and possibly stone structures now submerged beneath the ocean. From those fragments, we construct narratives, knowing they're incomplete and possibly wrong but valuable nonetheless, because the attempt to understand the past is itself meaningful. We're storytelling creatures, and the stories we tell about who came before us shape how we understand ourselves. Whether the Yonaguni monument is a human construction or a natural formation almost doesn't matter in the end. What matters is that people lived along those coasts 12,000 years ago, that they witnessed the ocean rising and adapted to it, that they created a culture sophisticated enough to produce some of the world's earliest pottery and sustainable enough to persist across millennia. That's the real story. Not the mystery of ambiguous stone formations, but the confirmed fact of human resilience and ingenuity in the face of massive environmental change. The ocean keeps its secrets well. What lies beneath the water is mostly inaccessible, too deep or too degraded or too dangerous to study thoroughly. We get glimpses, a stone formation here, a shell midden there, occasional finds that expand our understanding slightly, but the complete picture remains out of reach. And perhaps that's appropriate. The past doesn't owe us answers, and mystery has its own value, reminding us that knowledge is always partial and provisional, subject to revision as new evidence emerges or old evidence gets reinterpreted. You drift towards sleep again, your mind settling like sediment after being stirred. The last thought before unconsciousness is about water, how it covers, how it preserves, how it transforms everything it touches. The Jōmon knew water intimately, lived beside it, drew sustenance from it, and eventually watched it claim their coastal settlements. They adapted and moved and continued as humans do, finding new places to live and new ways to thrive. Their descendants are still here, walking the same islands, fishing the same waters, connected to the past through genetics and geography, even if the cultural continuity was broken long ago. The darkness deepens, and the questions fade. What remains is rest, stillness, the quiet satisfaction of having spent time considering things larger than yourself. The ocean continues its rhythms outside your awareness, tides rising and falling, currents moving according to patterns established long before human civilization and likely to continue long after. The stone formations, whatever they are, rest beneath those waters, patient and silent, waiting for the next researcher to puzzle over them, the next theory to explain them, the next generation to ask the same questions we've been asking since we first noticed them and wondered what hands, if any, shaped them from the living rock. Sleep takes you completely now, and the story ends where it began. In water, in darkness, in the slow dissolution of certainty into something softer and more accepting. The past is there, behind you and beneath you, always present even when invisible. And tomorrow when you wake, it will still be there, waiting quietly for anyone curious enough to look. The glaciers of Northern Europe and North America have been retreating for decades, exposing landscapes that haven't seen daylight in millennia. With each passing season, more ground emerges from beneath the ice, and with it, traces of human presence that challenge our understanding of how and where people lived in the past. This is a story about what happens when frozen time begins to thaw. You're walking across a snowfield in southern Norway, following a researcher who knows this landscape the way some people know the rooms of their childhood home. The year is recent, close enough to now that the equipment you're carrying is recognizable, the methods familiar. But the discoveries being made here belong to a different time entirely, to periods when the climate was different, when these mountains were passable in summer, when people moved through valleys that would later be sealed under ice for centuries. The researcher stops and crouches down near a patch of exposed ground where the snow has melted away. She's looking at something dark against the pale rock and dirt. At first, you can't tell what it is. Just a shape, organic and irregular, half embedded in the soil. She doesn't touch it. That's the first rule of glacial archaeology, the discipline that's emerged over the past few decades, as the ice has retreated and revealed what it's been hiding. Look, observe, photograph, document position. Don't disturb anything until you understand what you're seeing and what it might mean. You move closer, carefully, trying not to step on anything that might be significant. The object resolves itself as you approach. It's fabric, or what used to be fabric. Dark, waterlogged, partially decomposed but still recognizably textile. Woven material, the individual thread still visible despite centuries of exposure to moisture and cold. The researcher takes out her camera and begins photographing from multiple angles. She's documenting the find in situ, recording its exact position, its orientation, its relationship to the surrounding terrain. Later, these photographs will be part of the official record, evidence that will be studied by other researchers, referenced in papers, used to build understanding of what this place was and who used it. This happens more often than you might think. Since the late 1990s, when warming temperatures began accelerating the retreat of alpine glaciers and ice patches, archaeologists in Norway, Switzerland, Austria, Canada and Alaska have been finding artifacts emerging from the ice, not occasionally, regularly, sometimes dozens of objects in a single season, spanning thousands of years of human activity. The finds range from the mundane to the extraordinary. Shoes, thousands of years old, still recognizable as shoes. Arrows with intact shafts and fletching so well preserved that you can see the binding patterns, the workmanship, the individual choices made by whoever crafted them. Textiles, tools, even organic remains like horse dung and reindeer antlers, all emerging from the ice in conditions that allow for detailed analysis. What makes these discoveries significant isn't just their age or their preservation. It's what they reveal about human movement and adaptation. These artifacts are being found at high elevations, in mountain passes and on ice patches that are frozen for most of the year even now. The presence of human artifacts in these locations means people were travelling through high mountain terrain, probably seasonally, using routes that would later become impassable as the climate cooled and the ice expanded. The researcher carefully measures the distance from the textile fragment to several fixed reference points. Large boulders, distinctive rock formations, anything that will allow the exact location to be reconstructed later. She's using a handheld GPS unit to record coordinates, accurate to within a few meters. The measurements go into a field notebook, written clearly in waterproof ink. You ask her how old she thinks the textile might be. She doesn't answer immediately. That's not evasiveness, just caution. Dating requires laboratory analysis, usually radiocarbon dating of organic material, and even then the results come with margins of error. But based on the style of weaving visible in the fragment, based on similar finds from this region, she estimates it could be anywhere from 800 to 2,000 years old. Think about that range, 800 to 2,000 years. That's the span from the Viking Age to the Late Bronze Age, from a period of written records and established kingdoms to a time when writing was rare in this part of the world, and history was preserved through oral tradition. And somewhere in that span, someone walked through this mountain pass wearing or carrying this textile. Maybe it was part of their clothing. Maybe it was a bag or a bundle wrapping. Maybe it was dropped accidentally, or discarded because it was damaged, or left behind when someone died in the mountains and their companions could only carry so much back down. Whatever the circumstances, the textile ended up here, on this patch of ground, where it was gradually covered by snow that compressed into ice. And there it stayed, frozen and protected, while centuries passed, while the climate shifted, while the ice expanded and contracted in response to changes in temperature and precipitation that operated on timescales much longer than human lifespans. The researcher finishes her documentation and carefully collects the textile fragment, placing it in a sterile bag labelled with the location, date, and a unique identification number. The bag goes into a cooler, where it will stay cold until it can be transported to a laboratory for analysis. Temperature control is critical. These artifacts have been frozen for centuries. Allowing them to warm up and dry out too quickly can cause damage, can destroy the very features that make them valuable for research. You continue walking, scanning the ground as you go. The researcher explains that this is how most glacial archaeology happens, not through systematic excavation, but through reconnaissance, through regular monitoring of areas where the ice is retreating, looking for artifacts that are being exposed naturally as the snow melts. It's a race against time. Once an artifact emerges from the ice, it begins to deteriorate. Exposure to sunlight, to oxygen, to fluctuating temperatures, all of these accelerate decay. Organic materials like wood, leather, and textile can survive for thousands of years frozen in ice. But once they thaw, they can decompose in a matter of seasons. Some artifacts that emerge one summer are nothing but fragments by the next. This has created new urgency in archaeology. Glacial archaeologists now spend their summers monitoring ice patches and glacier edges, returning to the same locations year after year, checking for new finds. It's physically demanding work. The sites are at high elevations, often requiring hours of hiking to reach. The weather is unpredictable. The working season is short, limited to the brief window when the snow has melted enough to expose artifacts, but hasn't yet refrozen for winter. But the results have been remarkable. In Norway alone, the Glacier Archaeology program has recovered thousands of artifacts from melting ice, including some that have fundamentally changed understanding of how people used mountain landscapes in the past. You reach another area of exposed ground, this one larger, maybe 20 meters across. The snow has retreated from a slight depression in the terrain, creating a bowl-shaped area where meltwater has collected and then drained away, leaving behind a surface of gravel and mud. The researcher slows down, moving more carefully now. This kind of terrain, a natural trap where snow accumulates and melts repeatedly, is exactly where artifacts tend to appear. Objects that were lost or discarded on the ice would have been covered by subsequent snowfalls, but as the ice melts, they become concentrated in low spots like this one. She spots something almost immediately. A piece of wood, about as long as your forearm, partially embedded in the gravel. You can see even from a distance that it's been worked, that it's not just a natural stick. One end is carved to a point. The other end shows tool marks where it was shaped and smoothed. The researcher crouches beside it, begins her documentation process again. Photographs from multiple angles, GPS coordinates, measurements, notes about the exact position and condition. All of this before anyone touches the object. While she works, she explains that this is probably part of an arrow. Based on the size and shape, based on comparison with other finds from Norwegian ice patches, it's likely a main shaft section. The central part of an arrow that would have had a separate foreshaft at the tip where the arrowhead was attached, and fletching at the back for stability in flight. This kind of composite arrow construction was common across northern Europe and parts of North America for thousands of years. Different woods were selected for different parts of the arrow based on their properties. The main shaft might be pine or birch, relatively straight-grained and easy to work. The foreshaft, which had to withstand the impact of hitting the target, might be made from denser wood like dogwood or viburnum. The components were fitted together with bindings made from sinew or plant fibre, creating an arrow that was both effective and repairable. What's remarkable is that examples of these composite arrows, complete with their bindings intact, have been recovered from Norwegian ice. Not reconstructions or guesses based on archaeological evidence, but actual arrows, thousands of years old, that show exactly how they were made, what materials were used, how the components were fitted together. The researcher carefully extracts the shaft section from the gravel. It's surprisingly solid despite its age, the wood still firm, the tool mark still sharp and clear. She places it in a padded container, labels it, adds it to the growing collection of finds from this season. You ask her why people were up here in the first place. Why travel through high mountain passes when lower routes would have been easier, safer, more predictable? The answer is complex, she says, and still being researched. But the evidence suggests several possibilities. Hunting was certainly one reason. Reindeer and other game animals use ice patches in summer to escape heat and insects. Hunters following these animals would have travelled to high elevations, would have lost or discarded equipment in the snow. Many of the artefacts found in Norwegian ice are hunting-related. Arrows, spears, walking sticks, remains of wooden structures that might have been hunting blinds. But there's also evidence of travel, of people crossing mountain passes to move between valleys. Some of the finds include items that wouldn't be necessary for hunting. Textiles, tools for domestic tasks, objects that suggest people were travelling for trade or seasonal migration rather than just pursuing game. The distribution of artefacts supports this interpretation. They're not randomly scattered but concentrated along specific routes. Routes that follow natural corridors through the mountains. Routes that would make sense for someone trying to get from one valley to another with minimum elevation gain and maximum efficiency. These weren't modern hiking trails with markers and maintained paths. They were routes learned through experience, passed down through generations, known to people who travelled them regularly and understood the terrain, the weather patterns, the seasonal windows when passage was possible. And then the climate changed. Not suddenly. Climate never changes suddenly on human timescales. But gradually, over decades and centuries, the temperatures dropped, the snow accumulated, the ice patches expanded. Routes that had been passable in summer became increasingly difficult, then dangerous, then impossible. The high mountain passes closed, sealed under permanent snow and ice. The people who had used these routes adapted. They found other paths, lower elevations, longer routes that avoided the mountains. The high passes were abandoned, not all at once, but gradually, as each generation found them a little more difficult, a little less reliable, until eventually they stopped being used at all. And the artefacts that had been left behind, the lost arrows, the discarded tools, the occasional unfortunate traveller who died in the mountains, were covered by snow, preserved in ice, removed from the flow of time, until now. Until the climate shifted again, temperatures rose, and the ice began its retreat. Now those artefacts are emerging, appearing on the surface after centuries of frozen darkness, still recognisable, still interpretable, still able to tell their stories if someone knows how to read them. You continue across the exposed ground, moving slowly, scanning constantly. The researcher explains that many finds are discovered entirely by chance. Someone hiking across a snowfield spots something dark against the white, investigates, realises it's not a rock or piece of vegetation but an artefact. But there's also systematic monitoring now. Researchers return to known sites year after year, documenting how the ice edge is changing, where new ground is being exposed, what artefacts are appearing. Some programs use remote sensing, satellite imagery, aerial photography to identify areas where rapid melting is occurring, areas that should be prioritised for ground surveys. It's a global phenomenon. While Norway has been particularly successful with its glacier archaeology program, similar work is happening wherever glaciers and ice patches are retreating. In the Yukon, researchers have found entire hunting camps emerging from ice patches, complete with tools, weapons, and the remains of animals that were hunted and butchered on site. In the Alps, hikers regularly discover artifacts from everything from Neolithic travellers to Roman-era soldiers to medieval traders. Each find adds to the picture, fills in gaps in understanding about how people lived, moved, and adapted to changing conditions. But each find is also a reminder of what's being lost. For every artifact that's discovered and documented, there are probably dozens that emerge, decompose, and disappear before anyone sees them. The ice is revealing its secrets faster than archaeologists can document them. The researcher checks her watch. It's getting late, the sun starting its long, slow descent toward the horizon. Time to start heading back to base camp. But first, she wants to check one more area, a spot where she found fragments last year, where the continued melting might have exposed more. You follow her across the uneven ground, stepping carefully over rocks and patches of old snow. The landscape up here has a particular quality, Not desolate exactly, but spare, stripped down to essentials. Rock, snow, water, the occasional patch of hardy vegetation clinging to sheltered spots. Everything else is just space and light, and the clean mineral smell of melting ice. The spot she's looking for is marked on her GPS, but when you reach it, there's nothing obvious to see. Just more exposed ground, more gravel and mud, more patches of old snow slowly sublimating in the thin mountain air. But she's patient, methodical. She walks a grid pattern, covering the area systematically, looking at every patch of exposed ground, every dark spot, every irregularity that might be something other than rock. And then she stops, crouches down, calls you over. It's bone. Not large, maybe 10 centimetres long, but definitely bone, not wood or stone. It's been exposed recently, probably within the past few days, based on how it's positioned and the lack of weathering on the exposed surface. The researcher photographs it, documents it, but doesn't collect it immediately. Bone requires different handling than wood or textile. It's less fragile in some ways, more fragile in others. And the presence of bone raises questions about what else might be nearby. If this is from an animal that died here, there might be more remains, might be evidence of how and why the animal died, whether it was hunted or died naturally, whether humans were involved. She marks the location with a small flag, just a piece of bright orange plastic on a wire stake, and makes detailed notes about the exact position. This will require a more thorough investigation, probably a team with expertise in faunal remains, in taphonomy, in understanding how bones are preserved and what they can reveal about the circumstances of death and deposition. The sun is definitely lower now, the light turning golden, the shadows lengthening across the snowfield. Time to head back. The researcher takes a few final photographs, recording the overall scene, the context, the way the light falls across the landscape. You start the hike back to base camp following the route you took on the way up. The descent is easier physically but requires just as much attention. The ground is uneven, the rocks loose, the patches of old snow slippery and unpredictable. As you walk, the researcher talks about the challenges of glacial archaeology. The physical demands are obvious. The hiking, the altitude, the weather, the short season. But there are also intellectual challenges, interpretive challenges. The artifacts emerging from the ice are a biased sample. They represent only what was lost or discarded, only what happened to be in places where it got covered by snow and ice, only what's being revealed in the specific areas where melting is occurring. There's no way to know what's not being found, no way to know what artifacts were lost in areas that didn't get covered by ice, that were exposed to weathering and decomposition, that vanished without a trace. No way to know what's still buried under ice that hasn't melted yet, or what's been carried downslope by glacial movement and deposited in locations where no one will think to look. So the picture being built from glacial archaeology is necessarily incomplete. It's valuable, it's informative, it changes understanding in important ways. But it's not comprehensive. It's a window, not a panorama, a glimpse, not a complete view. Still, she says, it's better than nothing. It's evidence that wouldn't exist otherwise. Without the preservation provided by the ice, these artifacts would have decomposed centuries ago. Without the warming climate causing the ice to retreat, they would remain frozen and inaccessible. The timing is narrow, the window between still frozen and exposed to decay, but it's open now, and the work is happening, and knowledge is being built that adds to human understanding of the past. You reach the base camp as evening settles in, the temperature dropping, the wind picking up. Inside the tent that serves as a field laboratory, you can see other researchers working, examining finds from earlier in the day, entering data into laptops, preparing samples for shipment back to laboratories. The textile fragment and arrow shaft will join the collection, will be cleaned and analysed and dated, and eventually published in academic journals and included in museum exhibits. They'll become data points in the larger project of understanding how people used mountain landscapes, how they adapted to changing conditions, how they moved and hunted and travelled through terrain that seems impossibly remote and harsh by modern standards, but for now they're just objects. Pieces of wood and fabric, dark and waterlogged, still carrying the cold of the ice they've been released from, waiting patiently for the next phase of analysis, the next stage in their transformation from artifacts to evidence to knowledge. The laboratory where artifacts from glacial archaeology are analysed is nothing like the mountain fieldwork. It's climate-controlled, precisely lit, equipped with microscopes and chemical testing equipment, and computers running specialised analytical software. You're visiting one of these labs, watching as a conservator works on a leather shoe that was found in a Norwegian ice patch the previous summer. The shoe is approximately 1,500 years old, dated through radiocarbon analysis of the leather itself. It's remarkably intact. The sole, the upper, even some of the stitching still visible, still holding the components together after a millennium and a half of frozen preservation. The conservator is working under magnification, examining the stitching pattern, documenting the construction technique. Each detail is noted, photographed, added to the growing database of information about this single object. The shoe is made from a single piece of leather, folded and stitched to create both the sole and the upper. The stitching is done with thread that appears to be plant fibre, possibly linden bast or nettle, materials that were commonly used for cordage in pre-modern Scandinavia. The stitches are regular and careful, showing skilled workmanship, someone who knew what they were doing and took the time to do it well. This kind of detailed construction analysis reveals more than just how the shoe was made. It reveals knowledge systems, technical traditions, the accumulated wisdom of generations of craftspeople who had figured out through trial and error what worked and what didn't. The choice of materials, the way they're prepared and joined, the patterns of wear visible on the sole. All of this is information, is evidence of choices made and challenges addressed. The conservator points out a repair visible on one side of the shoe. The leather has torn, probably from normal wear, and someone has patched it, adding a piece of material and stitching it in place. The repair is competent but not as neat as the original construction, suggesting it was done in the field, by the wearer or a companion using whatever materials were available. That repair is significant. It tells you that the shoe was valued enough to be worth repairing rather than discarding. It suggests that footwear was difficult or expensive to replace, that people took care of their equipment because getting new equipment wasn't simple or easy. It indicates that the person wearing this shoe was travelling, was away from home or a settled community where more resources might have been available for making or trading for new shoes. And then, at some point, the shoe was lost. Maybe it came off in a stream crossing. Maybe it was abandoned when it became too damaged to repair further. Maybe the person wearing it died, and the shoe was left with their body, was gradually covered by snow and ice. Whatever the circumstances, the shoe ended up in a location where it was buried by snow that compressed into ice, where it was sealed away from oxygen and bacteria and the normal processes of decay. And there it remained, perfectly preserved, until the ice melted and it reappeared on the surface, still recognizable as a shoe, still interpretable, still able to reveal information about the person who made it and the person who wore it. You watch as the conservator moves to examine the sole, where wear patterns are visible. The way a shoe wears tells you something about how it was used, what kind of terrain it was walked on, whether the wearer had a particular gait or favoured one foot. This shoe shows even wear across the sole, suggesting regular use on relatively smooth ground. Trails probably, established paths where the walking was predictable. But there's also damage that looks more catastrophic. Areas where the leather is torn or abraded in ways that suggest rough terrain, scrambling over rocks, the kind of wear that comes from going off trail in difficult conditions. The picture that emerges is of someone travelling through mountains, following established routes when possible, but also willing to go cross-country when necessary. Someone who took care of their equipment but also used it hard, who needed their shoes to be functional and was willing to repair them in the field to keep them that way. Next to the shoe on the lab bench is an arrow, one of dozens recovered from Norwegian ice patches over the past 2 decades. This one is particularly well preserved. The wooden shaft complete, the sinew binding intact, even fragments of the feather fletching still attached. The conservator explains that arrows like this one were composite constructions, made from multiple components carefully fitted together. The main shaft is pine, a relatively common wood that's lightweight and straight-grained. The foreshaft, the separate front section that held the arrowhead, is made from birch, denser and more impact-resistant. The 2 pieces are joined with a socket joint, the foreshaft tapered to fit into a carved recess in the main shaft. The whole thing bound together with sinew that shrinks as it dries, creating a tight, permanent connection. At the back of the shaft, the fletching is attached with more sinew binding, wrapped in a crisscross pattern that holds the feathers in place, while allowing them to curve naturally, creating the aerodynamic surface that stabilizes the arrow in flight. The level of craft visible in this arrow is remarkable. Every component is carefully selected and prepared. The shaft is smoothed and balanced. The bindings are tight and regular. The fletching, though fragmentary now, shows evidence of having been trimmed and shaped to precise specifications. This wasn't a quick improvised weapon. This was a tool made by someone with expertise, someone who understood the materials and the techniques, and had probably made hundreds of similar arrows over their lifetime. The kind of knowledge that comes from apprenticeship and practice, from being part of a community where these skills were valued and passed down through demonstration and hands-on teaching. Radiocarbon dating has placed this arrow at approximately 3,400 years old, firmly in the late Bronze Age. The person who made it lived in a world without iron tools, without written records, without most of the technologies that later societies would take for granted. But they had sophisticated knowledge of materials and construction, they had effective hunting technology, and they had the confidence and capability to travel into high mountain terrain in pursuit of game. The conservator moves to a different workstation where several pieces of textile are laid out on a padded surface. These are fragments, nothing complete, but enough to show construction details. The weave is visible, the individual threads still distinct despite centuries of burial in ice. The textiles are made from wool, which makes sense for this region and time period. Sheep were common in Scandinavia, wool production was an established technology, and wool has properties that make it excellent for cold weather clothing. It insulates even when wet, it's durable, it can be woven or felted into various weights and textures. The weave pattern visible in these fragments is a simple tabby weave, the most basic form of textile construction, where warp and weft threads alternate over and under each other. It's not fancy or decorative, just functional, the kind of cloth that would be used for everyday clothing or bags or whatever needed to be made from fabric. But even this simple textile represents significant labour and knowledge. Someone had to shear the sheep, clean, and card the wool, spin it into thread, set up a loom and weave the cloth. Hours of work, probably days, to produce a piece of fabric that would then be cut and sewn into whatever was needed. And then that fabric ended up in the mountains, was lost or discarded, was covered by ice. And now it's here, in a laboratory, being examined under magnification, being documented and analysed and preserved for future study. The conservator explains that one of the challenges with glacial archaeology is conservation itself. These artefacts have been frozen for centuries or millennia. They're stable in that frozen state, but once they thaw, they become vulnerable. Organic materials start to decompose. Moisture inside the materials can cause damage as it freezes and thaws. Bacteria and fungi can begin to grow, so conservation is urgent. Artifacts need to be kept cold from the moment they're discovered until they can be properly stabilised. That usually means freeze drying, a process where the artifacts are frozen and then the ice is sublimated, converted directly from solid to gas in a vacuum chamber. This removes the moisture without allowing it to go through a liquid phase, preventing the damage that can occur when waterlogged materials dry out. After freeze drying, the artifacts are more stable, can be handled and examined more safely. But they're still fragile, still vulnerable to damage from handling, from exposure to light, from fluctuations in temperature and humidity. So they're stored in carefully controlled conditions, accessed only when necessary for study or display. The conservator shows you the storage area, a climate-controlled room where artifacts from multiple field seasons are carefully archived. Shelves hold boxes and containers, each labelled with identification numbers, dates, locations. Inside are the physical remains of past lives, shoes and arrows and textiles and tools, all recovered from melting ice, all carefully preserved and documented. It's a strange kind of museum, you think, not organised for public display, not arranged to tell a narrative, just a systematic collection of objects and information, raw material for research and understanding. But it's valuable precisely because it's systematic, because the focus is on preservation and documentation rather than presentation. These artifacts are evidence first, museum pieces second. They're here to be studied, to be analysed, to reveal information that can't be obtained any other way. The conservator pulls out one more item to show you, something different from the hunting equipment and textiles. It's a wooden ski, approximately 4,000 years old, recovered from an ice patch in northern Norway. The ski is narrow and long, carved from a single piece of pine. The top surface is flat with a slight depression near the centre where the foot would rest. The bottom surface shows careful shaping, slightly concave lengthwise to improve glide and control. Near the centre there's a foothold, a raised ridge that the foot would fit behind, held in place with a leather strap or cord. This is sophisticated snow travel technology. representing centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to move efficiently through winter landscapes. Skis like this one allowed people to travel across snow that would be impassable on foot, to hunt, to visit neighbours, to move between settlements during months when other forms of travel were impossible. The presence of 4,000-year-old skis in Norwegian ice tells you that winter travel was not just possible but routine, that people had developed effective technologies for dealing with snow and cold, that high-latitude life was sustainable and productive even in the depths of winter. And the fact that this ski survived, was preserved in ice for 4 millennia, is a reminder of how much has been lost. For every artifact that's recovered, there are probably hundreds or thousands that decomposed without a trace. The glacial archaeology record is biased toward the exceptional, the lucky accidents of preservation, the objects that happen to end up in conditions where ice could seal them away. But even this biased, incomplete record is transforming understanding of the past. Before glacial archaeology became possible, before the ice started retreating and revealing what it had preserved, knowledge about how people lived in these environments was based mostly on inference and reconstruction. Now there's direct physical evidence, actual objects that were used by actual people, that show rather than suggest how things were done. The conservator returns the ski to its storage box, handles it with practiced care. These artifacts are irreplaceable, she reminds you. Once they're gone, they're gone. The ice that preserved them is melting, is not going to refreeze. The window for recovery is now, this generation, these few decades when the ice is retreating but hasn't disappeared entirely. After that, whatever artifacts remain buried will likely be exposed to weathering and decay. The ice will be gone, the preservation will end, and the slow process of decomposition will resume. In a century or two, most of what's currently frozen will be reduced to fragments or dust, unrecognizable and uninterpretable. So the work is urgent, not in a dramatic save-the-world sense, but in a practical, time-sensitive sense. There's a finite window, a brief period when this recovery is possible. After that, the opportunity will be gone. Back in the mountains, the researcher is conducting another survey, this time in a different area where glacial retreat has accelerated in recent years. The landscape here is more dramatic. Steep slopes, exposed rock faces, a glacier terminus that's retreated several hundred meters in the past decade. The retreat is visible in the landscape itself. The glacier sits in its valley like water in a slowly draining bathtub, its edges pulling back year by year, exposing ground that's been covered for centuries. The rock near the ice edge is freshly scoured, still showing the striations and polish left by glacial movement. Further from the ice, where the ground has been exposed longer, vegetation is starting to colonize. Mosses and lichens at first, then hardy grasses and small shrubs. This is primary succession, the slow process of biological colonization that happens when new land is exposed. It takes time, decades or centuries, for soil to develop, for plants to establish, for the full complexity of an ecosystem to emerge. But it's happening, right here, in real time, as the ice continues its retreat. The researcher is interested in a particular area near the edge of an ice patch, a location where previous surveys found fragments that suggested more might be present. The ice patch is separate from the main glacier, a remnant of accumulated snow that's been semi-permanent for as long as anyone can remember, but is now visibly shrinking year by year. Ice patches like this one are particularly important for glacial archaeology. Unlike glaciers, which flow and move and can carry objects great distances from where they were deposited, ice patches are relatively static. They accumulate snow, compress it into ice, but don't flow significantly. So artifacts found near ice patches are usually close to where they were originally lost or deposited. This makes interpretation easier. If you find an arrow near an ice patch, it was probably lost by a hunter who was using the ice patch, probably hunting reindeer or other animals that congregate on patches of old snow to escape heat and insects in summer. If you find a collection of tools, it probably indicates a hunting camp or rest stop, a place where people pause during their travels. The researcher moves carefully across the exposed ground, eyes constantly scanning. She's developed an almost instinctive sense for what might be an artifact, what shapes and colours and textures are worth investigating. Most of what she sees is natural. Rocks, vegetation, the organic litter that accumulates wherever snow melts. But occasionally something stands out, something that doesn't quite fit the pattern. She stops. focuses on a dark line visible in the gravel a few meters ahead. It's straight, too straight to be a natural stick or root. She approaches carefully, crouches, examines it without touching. It's wood. Definitely worked. Carved smooth. Only a small section is visible above the surface, maybe 10 centimeters, but that's enough to identify it as potentially significant. She begins the documentation process, photographs, measurements, GPS coordinates, before attempting to extract it. When she does begin to excavate around the object, working carefully with a small trowel, more of it is revealed. It's a shaft, approximately a meter long, carved from a single piece of wood. One end is shaped to a blunt point. The other end has been hollowed out slightly, creating a socket that would have held another component. Based on the size and proportions, the researcher identifies it as likely a hunting spear or a ski pole. Both were common in this region historically. Both would have been made from similar materials and construction techniques. Distinguishing between them requires looking at other features: wear patterns, the shape of the socket, comparison with other known examples. She extracts the shaft carefully, supporting it as she lifts it free from the gravel. The wood is solid despite its age, the preservation excellent. Once it's out, she can examine it more closely, can see the tool marks where it was shaped, can feel the smooth surface that results from careful finishing. This object represents hours of work. Someone selected a suitable tree, cut it, stripped off the bark, shaped the wood through a combination of carving and scraping and smoothing. The result is a functional tool, well made and effective. And then it was lost. Dropped in the mountains, covered by snow, buried in the growing ice patch. And there it remained until now, until warming temperatures caused the ice to melt and the shaft to reappear on the surface. The researcher places the shaft in a padded container, adds it to the collection from this field season. She'll continue the survey, will check other areas where artifacts might be appearing, but this find alone makes the trip worthwhile. Another data point, another piece of physical evidence about how people used this landscape in the past. As the day continues, more finds emerge. A fragment of leather that might be from a shoe or bag. Several pieces of worked wood, too degraded to identify precisely but clearly anthropogenic. A bone, probably from a reindeer, showing cut marks that indicate butchering. Each find is documented, collected, added to the growing archive. The process is repetitive, methodical, but it's the only way to ensure that information is preserved, that each artifact is properly contextualized, that the data will be usable for future research. By late afternoon, the researcher has covered several square kilometers of exposed ground, has documented dozens of potential features, has collected a dozen artifacts that will be analysed back at the laboratory. It's good work, productive work, the kind of field day that justifies the effort and expense of mounting an expedition to these remote locations. But it's also bittersweet, in a way. Each artifact recovered is one that won't be destroyed by exposure to the elements. But for every artifact found, there are probably others that have been exposed, weathered, and decomposed before anyone saw them. The race between discovery and decay is ongoing, and decay doesn't take breaks, doesn't have off-seasons, doesn't require funding or permits. The ice is melting, the artifacts are appearing, and the small community of glacial archaeologists is doing what it can to document and recover what's being revealed before it's too late. The researcher packs up her equipment as the sun begins its descent. Tomorrow she'll be back. We'll cover different ground. We'll continue the systematic survey that is the backbone of glacial archaeology. But for today, the work is done, the finds are collected, and another small piece of the past has been preserved for future study. Evening at base camp finds you reviewing the day's photographs while the researchers discuss their findings over dinner. The conversation is technical but animated, focused on the details of what was found and what it might mean. The spear shaft or ski pole is generating particular interest. Its length and proportions are unusual, don't quite match other known examples from the region. The socket at one end is also distinctive, shaped in a way that suggests it was designed to hold a specific kind of attachment. One researcher thinks it might be a specialised hunting weapon, perhaps for a particular type of game. Another argues it's more likely a multi-purpose tool, something that could function as both walking stick and weapon depending on circumstances. The debate is good-natured, grounded in evidence and comparison with other known artifacts. This is how understanding develops, through careful observation, through comparison and analysis, through the gradual accumulation of data that allows patterns to emerge and interpretations to be tested. Someone mentions that a colleague in Canada has been finding similar artifacts in Yukon ice patches, evidence that the same kinds of technologies were being used across vast distances. The hunting strategies, the travel patterns, the basic approaches to surviving and thriving in high-latitude environments, these seem to have been remarkably consistent across cultures separated by thousands of kilometres. That consistency is interesting. It suggests that there are optimal solutions to certain environmental challenges, approaches that work well enough that they get independently developed or spread through cultural exchange across large regions. The composite arrow construction, for example, appears in archaeological contexts from Norway to Alaska, all dating to similar time periods, all showing the same basic design principles even if the specific details vary. Is that independent invention or cultural diffusion? It's hard to say, probably some combination of both. People are inventive, figure things out independently when faced with similar challenges. But people also travel, trade, share information, learn from each other. The ancient world was more connected than popular imagination often suggests. The artifacts emerging from the ice support this picture of mobility and connection. The presence of hunting equipment at high elevations indicates people were ranging widely, following game, exploring and utilizing marginal environments. The presence of textiles and tools suggests trade networks, because not all materials and skills were available in all locations. Someone built the spear shaft found today, but the person who built it might not have been the same person who used it. The raw material might have come from one location, the shaping done in another, the final object traded or gifted to someone in a third location who then carried it up into the mountains where it was eventually lost. Tracing these networks, understanding these connections, is part of what makes archaeology valuable. It's not just about finding old objects, it's about reconstructing the social and economic systems that produced those objects, the human relationships and exchanges that moved materials and ideas across landscapes. The conversation shifts to broader questions about climate and adaptation. The artifacts being found in glacial ice date from periods when the climate was warmer, when ice patches were smaller or absent, when mountain routes were more easily passable. Those periods correspond to what climate scientists call the Holocene climatic optimum and the medieval warm period, times when average temperatures in the northern hemisphere were somewhat higher than in the centuries immediately before or after. During those warm periods, people adapted by expanding into marginal environments, by using high mountain passes, by developing technologies and strategies that allowed them to exploit resources in areas that were borderline habitable. They thrived, established patterns and traditions, built knowledge systems that were passed down through generations. And then the climate cooled. Not catastrophically, not overnight, but gradually, persistently, over decades and centuries. The ice patches grew, the mountain passes became less reliable, more dangerous, eventually impassable. Routes that had been used for generations were abandoned. People adapted again, found different routes, adjusted their patterns, survived and continued. But the knowledge of the old routes, the specific details of how to travel through high mountain terrain, that knowledge faded, was lost, became irrelevant because the conditions that made it useful no longer existed. Until now. Until the climate shifted again, temperatures rose and the ice began to retreat. The old routes are reappearing, the artifacts are emerging, and the knowledge of how people lived and travelled in those past warm periods is becoming accessible again. It's a reminder that climate has always changed, that human societies have always adapted to changing conditions. The past offers examples of how people responded to warming, to cooling, to shifts in precipitation and seasonality. Those examples don't provide simple answers to modern challenges. The scale and rate of current climate change is unprecedented, and modern society is vastly more complex than anything in the archaeological record. But the past does provide perspective. It shows that adaptation is possible, that humans are creative and resilient, that knowledge and technology can be developed to meet new challenges. It also shows that adaptation sometimes means leaving places that become uninhabitable, that not all changes can be fully mitigated, that there are costs and losses alongside the innovations and adjustments. The researchers continue their discussion as darkness settles over the mountains. Outside, the temperature drops, the wind picks up, and somewhere nearby the ice continues its slow retreat, millimetre by millimetre, exposing more ground, revealing more artifacts, offering more glimpses into the past. Tomorrow the work will continue. More surveys, more documentation, more careful collection and preservation of artifacts that are appearing after centuries of frozen darkness. It's patient work, unglamorous work, the kind of archaeology that happens in remote locations with minimal public attention. But it matters. It's expanding knowledge, recovering information that would otherwise be lost, building understanding about how humans have lived and adapted in challenging environments throughout history. The glacier doesn't care about any of that. It just melts, following the physics of heat transfer and phase change, responding to temperature and solar radiation, indifferent to the human meanings assigned to what it reveals. But the people doing this work care. They see value in the fragments and traces emerging from the ice. They invest time and effort in documenting and preserving what's being revealed. They ask questions and seek answers, build interpretations and test hypotheses, contribute to the collective human project of understanding where we come from and how we got here. And slowly, artifact by artifact, site by site, the picture emerges. Not complete, never complete, always fragmentary and partial, but real, grounded in physical evidence, in objects that can be held and examined, in patterns that can be documented and analysed. The past is coming back, piece by piece, as the ice releases what it has held for so long. And for this brief window, this moment when the ice is retreating but the artefacts haven't all decomposed, there's an opportunity to recover and preserve evidence that will be gone forever if it's not collected now. So the work continues. The researchers return to the mountains each summer, monitor the ice edges, search the exposed ground, document what they find. It's slow work, patient work, the kind of science that doesn't produce dramatic breakthroughs, but does produce steady accumulation of knowledge. And in laboratories and museums and archives, the artifacts are preserved, the data is organised, the patterns are analysed, papers are written, presentations given, exhibitions mounted. The information diffuses into the broader academic community, into public awareness, into the general understanding of human history and adaptation. The ice is melting, the past is emerging, and for those who know how to look, how to interpret what's being revealed, it's a remarkable time, a unique window into periods that were previously accessible only through inference and reconstruction. You're back at the site one final time before the season ends and winter returns. The snow is already starting to fall at higher elevations, dusting the peaks, beginning the process that will seal everything away again for another year. The exposed ground where artifacts were found is already partially covered with fresh snow. By next week it will probably be completely buried. The artifacts that were recovered are safe, are already in laboratories being analysed and preserved. But anything that remains undiscovered will spend another winter frozen, another season sealed beneath snow and ice. The researcher is making final documentation, taking photographs that show the site in its late season condition, noting what's visible and what's already been covered by new snowfall. These observations will be compared with next summer's survey, will show how the ice edge has moved, how much new ground has been exposed, what changes have occurred. It's part of the long-term monitoring that makes glacial archaeology possible. Individual finds are valuable, but patterns emerge from systematic observation over time. Seeing how quickly the ice is retreating, which areas are being exposed, what kinds of artifacts are appearing, all of this builds understanding not just of the past, but of the present process of revelation. The wind is cold, carrying flakes of snow that sting exposed skin. Winter is asserting itself, reclaiming the mountains, restoring the patterns that have dominated these landscapes for most of recent history. The brief summer window when the ground is exposed and accessible is closing. You think about cycles, about the way the landscape oscillates between frozen and thawed, accessible and sealed, revealing and concealing. The ice advanced, buried the artifacts, preserved them. The ice is retreating, exposing the artifacts, allowing them to be found. But eventually, decades from now, centuries from now, the climate will cool again, the ice will return, and what's being revealed now will be buried once more. Or maybe not. Maybe the current warming trend will continue, will accelerate, will result in the complete disappearance of these glaciers and ice patches. In that scenario, everything that's currently frozen will be exposed, will have its brief moment of accessibility before weathering and decay reduce it to nothing. Either way, this moment, this period when the ice is retreating but hasn't disappeared, is unique, unrepeatable. The window for glacial archaeology is now. In a generation or two, the window will close one way or another. Either there will be no more ice to retreat, or the ice will have advanced again and the artifacts will be sealed away once more. The researcher takes a few final photographs, then begins packing up her equipment. It's time to head down, to close the base camp, to end the field season. Next summer, she'll be back. We'll check these same locations. We'll see what new ground has been exposed, what new artifacts have appeared. But for now, the work is done. The mountain is reclaiming its solitude, and beneath the falling snow, the ice holds what it holds, keeping its secrets until the next round of melting reveals them. You take one last look at the landscape before turning to follow the researcher down the mountain. The glacier looms above, massive and ancient, its surface crevassed and blue in the fading light. Below, the valley stretches away, already filling with evening shadow. Somewhere beneath that ice, there are probably more artifacts. More arrows and tools, more textiles and shoes, more fragments of lives lived centuries ago. Some will be revealed in coming years as the ice continues to retreat. Others will remain buried, will never be found, will be lost when the ice finally disappears and takes its remaining secrets with it. That's the nature of preservation and loss. Not everything can be saved. Not everything will be found. The glacial archaeology record will always be incomplete, always be a sampling rather than a comprehensive collection. But what has been found, what is being found each summer as the ice retreats, that's valuable beyond measure. Each artifact is a connection to the past, a tangible link to people who lived and worked and travelled in these mountains, when conditions were different, when routes that are now sealed were open, when knowledge that is now lost was current and practical. The snow is falling harder now, accumulating quickly on the exposed ground. You walk carefully, following the researcher's footsteps, making your way down to warmer elevations. Behind you, the site disappears beneath its winter blanket, hidden once again, waiting patiently for next summer when the cycle will repeat. This is how glacial archaeology happens, season by season, year by year, gradually recovering what the ice has preserved and is now releasing. It's slow work, but it's steady work. And with each passing summer, more is learned, more is understood, more pieces of the past are recovered and preserved. The ice is melting, the past is emerging. And for this brief window in geological time, humans have the opportunity to witness and document what's being revealed. You reach the lower elevations as darkness settles over the mountains. The snow is lighter here, not yet accumulating, just falling and melting, falling and melting. Above, the peaks disappear into clouds, the glacier invisible in the darkness and weather. But it's there, still retreating, still revealing, still holding artifacts that will appear next summer, or the summer after, or in years further in the future. The process continues whether anyone is watching or not, driven by climate and physics rather than human observation. But the observation matters, the documentation matters, the careful collection and preservation and analysis, all of it matters, because without it the artifacts would appear and weather away and be lost, and the information they contain would be gone forever. So the work continues, will continue next season, and the seasons after, as long as the ice keeps retreating and artifacts keep appearing. It's a unique moment in human history, this window when the past is being revealed at an unprecedented rate, when knowledge that was lost is becoming accessible again. And somewhere in that process, in the patient work of documenting and studying and interpreting what's emerging from the ice, there's a kind of quiet victory. Not over time or entropy, those forces are unstoppable, but over forgetting, over the silence that would otherwise swallow these lives and these stories. The artifacts speak if you know how to listen. They tell of people who adapted to harsh environments, who developed sophisticated technologies, who travelled and hunted and lived in places that seem impossibly remote by modern standards. They tell of resilience and ingenuity, of knowledge passed down through generations, of the fundamental human capacity to survive and even thrive in challenging conditions. And they remind us that the past is not separate from the present, that the landscapes we inhabit have been inhabited before, that the challenges we face have been faced in different forms by those who came before us. The ice is melting, the past is waking up. And for those paying attention, for those doing the patient work of documentation and preservation, it's a remarkable gift. This window into times and lives that would otherwise remain forever hidden beneath the ice. Before the great empires wrote their histories in stone and papyrus, before the official records began cataloguing who belonged where, the desert was already keeping secrets. In the vast stretches of sand between what we now call China and Central Asia, the Earth was preserving bodies with a care and precision that would baffle archaeologists thousands of years later. This is the story of what emerged from that sand, and why it took so long for anyone to talk about it. You've probably never thought much about the Tarim Basin. Most people haven't. It's one of those geographical features that gets a brief mention in world history classes, usually in connection with the Silk Road, and then is promptly forgotten. But if you were to stand in the middle of it, surrounded by the Taklamakan Desert, a name that translates roughly to "you go in and you don't come out," you might reconsider its significance. The air there is so dry it feels like it's pulling moisture from your skin, your lungs, your very thoughts. The Tarim Basin sits in what is now China's Xinjiang region, a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by some of the world's highest mountains, the Himalayas to the south, the Tian Shan Range to the north. It's a natural fortress, though not the kind designed to keep armies out. This fortress was built by geology and climate, and what it keeps at bay isn't invaders, but rather moisture, rainfall, and any hint of the life-giving dampness that enables decay. In most places on Earth, when you die, nature gets to work immediately. Bacteria, insects, moisture, and temperature fluctuations, they all conspire to return your body to the soil within months, sometimes weeks. It's efficient, really, the great recycling program that keeps the planet's nutrients in circulation. But the Tarim Basin didn't get that memo. The extreme dryness, the alkaline soil, and the temperature swings between scorching days and freezing nights, they created something rare, a natural mummification chamber the size of a small country. The funny thing about archaeological preservation is that it's completely democratic. A pharaoh and a peasant, given the right conditions, will keep equally well. The desert doesn't care about your tax bracket or your political connections. It just quietly, patiently, removes the water from your tissues and lets the salt in the soil do the rest. No elaborate burial rituals were required, though as you'll see, the people buried in the Tarim Basin did have their own ideas about sending off their dead. For thousands of years, bodies accumulated in this desert. Not in massive necropolises like you'd find in Egypt, but in smaller burial grounds scattered along what would eventually become trade routes. The people who lived there, and we'll get to who they were in a moment, seemed to understand something about their environment. They buried their dead in the dry soil, sometimes in boat-shaped coffins, sometimes wrapped in textiles that would become clues to mysteries no one had yet thought to ask. The sand drifted over these burial sites. Years became centuries, centuries became millennia. The surface of the desert shifted and resettled like a restless sleeper, but underneath, in the stable, cool darkness, the mummies waited. Their faces, their hair, their clothes, even the food offerings left with them, all of it remained, held in a kind of temporal suspension that modern preservation techniques can only dream of achieving. By the time anyone started looking, really looking, at what the Tarim Basin contained, the world had already drawn its maps. The borders were set, the official histories were written. Everyone knew where everyone belonged, or at least everyone thought they knew. The textbooks had their narratives. The museums had their timelines. Everything was sorted, categorized, and filed away neatly. And then someone pulled a mummy from the sand, and its eyes were blue. The first systematic excavations in the Tarim Basin began in earnest in the 20th century, though European explorers had been poking around the edges since the late 1800s. Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-British archaeologist with an impressive beard and an even more impressive ability to travel in uncomfortable conditions, made several expeditions to the region in the early 1900s. He was looking for Buddhist manuscripts mostly, evidence of the cultural exchange that had flowed along the Silk Road. What he found among the ruins of ancient cities and monasteries were bodies, but not just any bodies. These were mummies with light brown hair, sometimes auburn or even blonde. Their faces, dried and preserved by the desert, showed features that looked distinctly European. High cheekbones, prominent noses, And yes, in some cases where tissue preservation allowed for determination, like coloured eyes. Now, if you've been paying attention to world history as it's typically taught, you know this presents a problem. The timeline doesn't work. These weren't medieval travellers who'd wandered east from Europe. The oldest of these mummies dated back nearly 4,000 years. They were buried when Stonehenge was still relatively new, when the Great Pyramids of Egypt were already ancient, and when the written word was just starting to catch on in Mesopotamia. The standard narrative of human migration placed European features firmly west of the Ural Mountains during this period. Central Asia was supposed to be the domain of people who looked, well, Central Asian. The neat categories everyone had established were suddenly looking rather messy. Stein, to his credit, documented what he found. He took photographs, made notes, and collected samples. But he didn't make a huge fuss about the implications. Perhaps he sensed that this was the kind of discovery that needed careful handling. Or perhaps, in the early 1900s, the tools for understanding what these bodies meant simply didn't exist yet. The mummies went into storage, into museum collections, and into the careful language of academic papers that described them without quite engaging with the larger questions they raised. Terms like Caucasoid features appeared in the literature, which is anthropology's way of saying these people looked European without actually saying that, because saying that would require explaining how that was possible, and nobody was quite ready to do that yet. Meanwhile, more bodies kept emerging from the sand. The Beauty of Lulan, discovered in 1980, became one of the most famous. She was approximately 3,800 years old when archaeologists found her, and her preservation was remarkable. Her hair, still reddish-brown, had been gathered and tucked under a felt hat. Her face, though mummified, retained enough structure to see that she'd been somewhere in her 40s when she died. She wore a fur coat and felt boots, and beside her lay a basket and a comb. She looked like she could have been from Celtic Britain, or Scandinavia, or any number of places very, very far from the Tarim Basin. The thing about scientific discoveries that challenge existing narratives is that they tend to accumulate slowly. One unusual find can be explained away as an anomaly, a traveller, an outlier. Two can be coincidence. But when you start pulling dozens, then hundreds, of mummies from the desert, all showing similar features, all dating to periods when they supposedly shouldn't exist in that region, the anomaly becomes the pattern. By the late 20th century, as DNA analysis became possible, researchers started getting answers that raised even more questions. The genetic markers in these ancient bodies showed connections to populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the region north of the Black and Caspian Seas. This was the homeland of the Yamnaya culture and their descendants, the people who, current evidence suggests, spread Indo-European languages across much of Europe and Asia. But here's where it gets interesting. These Tarim Basin mummies weren't pure representatives of any one population group. Their genetic signatures showed mixing, blending, and the kind of diversity you get when people from different regions meet, settle together, and build communities. They were, in the truest sense, people of the crossroads. When you picture an ancient burial, you might imagine pyramids, elaborate tombs, and chambers filled with gold and treasure. The burials in the Tarim Basin were nothing like that. They were, in their own way, far more intimate. The people who lived along these early routes buried their dead with care, but not with grandeur. The graves were typically shallow, dug into the desert floor, and sometimes lined with wood or reeds. Bodies were often wrapped in textiles, layer upon layer of woolen fabric, sometimes with patterns woven in natural dyes that had survived the millennia. The colours had faded, of course, but if you looked closely at the fragments, you could still see geometric designs, borders, and the kinds of patterns that take hours at a loom to create. Many bodies were placed in wooden coffins shaped like boats, not elaborate vessels, but simple, hull-like containers made from local timber. The symbolism seems clear enough, a boat to carry the deceased on some final journey, though of course we can't know for certain what these people believed about death and what came after. The boats pointed east, generally, toward the rising sun, which might mean something, or might just mean that the people doing the burying liked consistency. The grave goods were practical. Food offerings, yes, but also tools, combs, and small bags that might have held seeds or herbs. These weren't people preparing their dead for an afterlife of luxury. They were sending them off with the things a person might need on a journey: sustenance, implements, and familiar objects. One burial, excavated near the site of Keveragul, contained a woman buried with a bag of ephedra, a plant with medicinal properties that still grows in the region. Someone had thought to include this, had perhaps known that the deceased valued these herbs, used them and needed them. It's such a small detail, but it speaks to the care involved. These weren't anonymous burials. These were people laying to rest someone they knew, someone whose preferences and needs they remembered. The textiles tell their own stories. The woolen fabrics found wrapping the mummies show advanced weaving techniques, with twill patterns and plaid designs that wouldn't look out of place in Iron Age Europe. The dyes came from local plants: madder root for reds, woad for blues, and various minerals for earth tones. The fibres themselves came from sheep, which means these communities were pastoral, raising livestock in the marginal lands around the desert's edges. Some bodies wore felt hats, tall conical affairs that would have provided excellent sun protection in the desert climate. Others had leather boots, stitched with remarkable precision considering they were made without metal needles. The craftsmanship was excellent, the kind of quality that comes from generations of accumulated knowledge about working with materials, about what holds up under use, and about what works. You start to get a picture of a people who knew their environment intimately. They weren't lost travellers who'd stumbled into the desert and died. They were communities that had adapted to this harsh landscape and had figured out how to live in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. The burials reflect that adaptation. No elaborate structures that would require resources better spent on the living. No attempts to deny death or dress it up as something else. Just quiet acknowledgement, careful preparation, and the desert doing the rest. The burial sites themselves were often marked with wooden posts or small stone cairns, enough to locate the grave, but nothing ostentatious. Over time, as the sand drifted and shifted, even these markers disappeared. The graves became invisible, buried under layers of accumulated sediment, waiting for archaeologists with shovels and brushes and an interest in what the desert had preserved. You might think that discovering hundreds of well-preserved mummies with unexpected features would immediately spark international excitement and extensive research. You would be wrong. The archaeological community approached the Tarim mummies with what can only be described as extreme caution, bordering on reluctance. Part of this hesitation was practical. The region itself was difficult to access, politically sensitive, and not particularly welcoming to large-scale foreign archaeological expeditions. The early 20th century saw some exploration, yes, but it was sporadic, underfunded, and often more interested in recovering artifacts than in understanding the people who made them. But part of the hesitation was theoretical. The Tarim mummies didn't fit neatly into existing frameworks for understanding human migration and cultural development in Asia. The dominant narratives of the mid-20th century had clear ideas about where different populations belonged and when they got there. These mummies suggested a far more complex story, one that involved unexpected movements of people across vast distances at surprisingly early dates. Some archaeologists simply didn't know what to do with the evidence. The mummies showed European features, yes, but calling them European would be anachronistic. The concept of Europe as a distinct cultural entity didn't exist 4,000 years ago. These people predated the classical civilizations that would eventually define what we mean by European culture. They were something else entirely, something that existing terminology struggled to capture. So the mummies got catalogued, photographed, measured, and then, often, quietly shelved. Academic papers described them in careful, neutral language that avoided drawing sweeping conclusions. The bodies were classified by site, by dating, and by burial style. But the larger question of what their presence in the Tarim Basin meant for our understanding of ancient migration patterns remained largely unasked. the few researchers who did try to engage with these questions found themselves navigating a minefield of potential misinterpretation. In the 20th century, as you might recall, discussions of racial origins and population movements had been thoroughly poisoned by the misuse of such research for political purposes. Any attempt to talk about where different groups came from or how they related to modern populations risked being hijacked for ideological agendas that had nothing to do with science. So a kind of uneasy silence settled over the field. The mummies existed. Everyone acknowledged that. They were interesting, certainly, but perhaps it was better not to ask too many questions about what they meant. It's better to wait for better evidence, better techniques, and better ways of interpreting the data. This hesitation extended to public presentation as well. Museums that acquired Tarim mummies often displayed them without much context, treating them as curiosities rather than as evidence of significant cultural contact. The labels might mention the Silk Road, which was safe territory, well established in popular understanding. But they rarely engaged with the uncomfortable chronology, that these people died long before the Silk Road existed as a formalised trade network, that they represented something earlier, something we didn't have a good name for. The funny thing about archaeological hesitation is that it creates a vacuum, and nature abhors a vacuum. When mainstream archaeology declined to engage fully with the implications of the Tarim mummies, the void got filled by less rigorous interpretations. Fringe theories proliferated: lost tribes, Aryan origins, ancient seafarers. The mummies became props in any number of dubious narratives, precisely because the legitimate archaeological community had failed to tell their story clearly. It wasn't until the late 20th century, when DNA analysis provided a new tool for understanding ancient populations, that the hesitation began to lift. Suddenly, instead of arguing about skull measurements or subjective assessments of features, researchers could look at actual genetic markers, trace lineages, and build family trees that connected ancient peoples to each other and to modern populations. Even then, the process was slow. Getting permission to extract samples from valuable, well-preserved mummies took time and negotiation. The techniques themselves were evolving, becoming more precise and less destructive. Early DNA studies often damaged the samples they analysed, which made museums understandably reluctant to allow testing on irreplaceable specimens. While archaeologists were being cautious about the mummies themselves, a quieter revolution was happening in the study of the objects buried with them. Textiles and tools don't carry the same political weight as human remains. They can reveal cultural connections and technological knowledge without triggering debates about racial origins or modern territorial claims. The woven fabrics found in the Tarim Basin burials were remarkable on several levels. First, there was the simple fact of their preservation. Textiles are usually among the first things to decay in burial environments. They're organic and fragile, exactly the kind of material that bacteria and moisture destroy quickly. Finding woven wool that had survived thousands of years was, in itself, extraordinary. But more than that, the textiles told stories about technology and trade. The weaving techniques showed clear connections to traditions found in Bronze Age Europe and the Near East. Twill weaves, particularly the 2/2 diagonal patterns found in some of the Tarim fabrics, were sophisticated techniques that required specific loom setups and considerable skill to execute. The patterns themselves were revealing. Plaids and checks, created by using different coloured threads in the warp and weft, appeared in several burials. These weren't random patterns. They were deliberate designs that required planning. You had to know before you started weaving exactly where each coloured thread would go to create the desired effect. The people making these textiles had both the technical knowledge and the aesthetic sensibility to create complex, attractive fabrics. Some of the dyes used in the textiles came from plants that grew locally in Central Asia. Others suggested trade connections or, at minimum, knowledge of dye-producing plants from regions far to the west. Madder root, which produces a stable red dye, was used extensively. The quality of the red colour in some samples suggested sophisticated dye techniques. including mordanting processes that helped the colour bond permanently to the wool fibres. The tools buried with the dead were equally informative. Combs made from wood and bone showed wear patterns consistent with regular use on human hair. Some of the women's burials included spindle whorls, the weighted discs that helped create consistent thread tension when spinning wool. These weren't symbolic objects. They showed the nicks and smoothing of actual use. Baskets found in several graves demonstrated expert knowledge of local plant resources. The weavers had used reeds and grasses specific to the Central Asian wetlands, crafting containers that were both functional and aesthetically pleasing. The weaving techniques varied from simple plaiting to more complex twined structures, suggesting a rich tradition of basket making that drew on multiple cultural influences. Leatherworking was another area where the archaeological evidence proved illuminating. The boots and bags found with the mummies showed advanced tanning techniques. The leather was soft, supple, and precisely stitched. Some pieces showed decorative elements, tooled patterns, dyed sections that went beyond pure utility into the realm of craft and artistry. What emerged from studying these objects was a picture of material culture that blended influences from multiple regions. The textiles showed connections to Western weaving traditions. The basket-making techniques had local Central Asian roots. The leatherworking showed innovations that might have been indigenous developments or might have been learned from neighbouring cultures. This mixing of traditions makes sense when you think about it. The Tarim Basin wasn't isolated. It sat at the crossroads of several ecological zones and migration routes. People moving through the region would have brought their technologies with them, shared knowledge, and learned from each other. Over generations, these different traditions would blend, creating hybrid forms that combined the best elements of multiple approaches. The tools also revealed something about daily life that the mummies themselves couldn't show. These communities were pastoral, certainly. The abundance of wool and leather made that clear. But they were also settled enough to invest in relatively elaborate textile production. You don't build a complex loom if you're moving camp every few weeks. You don't develop sophisticated weaving patterns unless you have the time and stability to experiment and refine techniques. Food remains found in some graves added another layer to this picture. Wheat and millet, both cultivated grains, appeared alongside the bones of sheep and cattle. These people practiced mixed agriculture, growing crops where irrigation allowed, while also maintaining herds that could graze the marginal lands around the desert's edges. It was a balanced approach to survival in a difficult environment, combining multiple food sources to hedge against the failure of any single one. Open a world history textbook from the mid-20th century, and you'll find a remarkably tidy story about human migration and settlement. Modern humans evolved in Africa, spread into Europe and Asia in distinct waves, and eventually populated the entire globe. Each region got its own chapter, its own civilization, its own neat progression from hunter-gatherers to farmers to city builders. The Silk Road, when it appeared in these narratives, was a medieval phenomenon, maybe stretching back to classical antiquity if the textbook was being generous. It connected East and West, facilitated the exchange of goods and ideas, and maybe contributed to the spread of Buddhism. A few paragraphs, perhaps a colourful map showing the routes, and then on to the next topic. Central Asia, in this telling, was mostly empty space. The region between civilizations, important mainly as a corridor for trade and occasionally for invasions. The people who actually lived there were background characters, nomads and merchants who enabled the real story, the interactions between the great civilizations of China, India, Persia, and eventually Europe. This simplification wasn't entirely the fault of the textbook writers. They were working with the information available to them, and until quite recently, that information was limited. Archaeological work in Central Asia was sporadic, often focused on the ruins of Buddhist monasteries and other structures that fit into established historical narratives. The desert burials, with their uncomfortable implications for those narratives, simply didn't make it into the standard accounts. But there was also an element of convenience in the simplification. Complex stories are hard to teach. Students struggle to keep track of too many different groups moving in too many directions. Teachers appreciate narratives that build logically from one chapter to the next. Textbook publishers like accounts that can be summarised in clear topic sentences and tested with multiple choice questions. The Tarim mummies didn't fit into this pedagogical framework. They suggested that Central Asia, far from being empty space between civilizations, had been home to diverse communities with their own rich material cultures long before the Silk Road formalised into a trade network. They indicated that population movements in prehistory were more complex, more multi-directional, and more interesting than the standard account suggested. They also complicated the timeline. The textbooks had clear demarcations. The Bronze Age happened here, the Iron Age happened there, and civilizations rose in this order. But the Tarim Basin communities seemed to operate on their own schedule, developing sophisticated textile technologies while their chronological contemporaries elsewhere were still figuring out basic agriculture, or conversely, maintaining relatively simple settlement patterns while great cities rose in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley. So the textbooks left them out. Not deliberately, not as part of some conspiracy to hide information, but simply because they didn't fit. They were anomalies, and anomalies don't make it into survey courses. There's only so much you can cover in a semester, only so many pages in a textbook. Editors make choices, teachers make choices, and the Tarim mummies, fascinating as they were to specialists, got left on the cutting room floor. The effect of this omission was cumulative. Generations of students learned a version of history that had Central Asia as a blank space, a region that only became important when it served as a corridor for other people's stories. The indigenous cultures of the region, the communities that had adapted to those harsh environments and built lives there, remained invisible. Even when the Silk Road did appear in textbooks, it was often treated as primarily Chinese or sometimes as a Persian/Middle Eastern phenomenon. The implication was that the trade routes existed to serve the needs of these major civilizations, connecting them across otherwise insignificant territory. The people actually living along those routes, who served as guides and traders and intermediaries, and who maintained the infrastructure that made long-distance trade possible, rarely got mentioned by name. This created a strange situation where you could learn quite a bit about ancient trade networks without ever understanding who actually lived in the regions those networks crossed. The goods moved from point A to point B, but the space between was treated as essentially empty, a void to be crossed rather than a place where people made homes and raised families and developed their own distinctive cultures. The funny thing is, the information was available. Archaeological reports existed. Museums had specimens. Academic journals published articles. But there's a difference between information existing somewhere in specialist literature and information being integrated into the broader narrative we tell about human history. The Tarim mummies existed in the former category, but not the latter. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, several factors converged to force a re-evaluation of what the Tarim mummies meant. DNA analysis became more sophisticated and less destructive. Archaeological techniques improved, and perhaps most importantly, a new generation of researchers approached the material without the same theoretical baggage that had constrained earlier work. The genetic studies proved particularly illuminating. Instead of trying to argue about features or measurements, researchers could now look at actual genetic markers and trace lineages with reasonable precision. The results confirmed what the physical appearance of the mummies had suggested. These people had ancestors from the Western Steppes, the region that had also given rise to populations that spread across Europe. But the genetics also revealed something more nuanced. These weren't recent migrants who had just arrived in the Tarim Basin. The DNA showed mixing with East Asian populations, suggesting that the communities in the Tarim Basin had been there for generations, intermarrying with neighbouring groups and creating a distinctive genetic profile that was neither purely Western nor purely Eastern, but something unique. This genetic evidence changed the conversation. Instead of asking, how did Europeans get to Central Asia? researchers started asking better questions. How did people from the western steppes reach the Tarim Basin? When did they arrive? Who did they encounter when they got there? What kind of communities did they build? Archaeological work intensified in the region, with Chinese institutions taking the lead. New sites were excavated with careful attention to context. Everything found with the burials, not just the spectacularly preserved bodies, but also the seeds and pollen, the animal bones and the fragments of wood and fibre, got analysed using the latest techniques. A picture emerged of communities that practiced mixed agriculture and pastoralism, living in small settlements along the rivers that flowed from the surrounding mountains into the desert. They raised sheep and cattle, grew wheat and millet, and probably hunted and gathered to supplement their food supply. They wove sophisticated textiles, made baskets and leather goods, and maintained long-distance trade connections that brought in goods from both east and west. These weren't primitive nomads barely surviving in a harsh environment. They were skilled agriculturalists and craftspeople who had successfully adapted to a challenging landscape. Their burial customs suggested spiritual beliefs and social structures sophisticated enough to merit careful preparation of the dead. Their material culture showed innovation and aesthetic sensibility. The timeline also came into better focus. The earliest of the Tarim mummies dated to around 2000 BCE, with the community seeming to flourish during the Bronze Age and into the early Iron Age. This meant they were contemporary with the later phases of Stonehenge, with the New Kingdom in Egypt and with the Shang dynasty in China. They weren't prehistoric in the sense of being primitive. They were Bronze Age people with Bronze Age technologies and presumably Bronze Age levels of social complexity. Linguistic evidence added another dimension to the re-evaluation. The Tocharian languages, known from Buddhist manuscripts found in the region and dating to the 1st millennium CE, were Indo-European languages showing interesting connections to Western Indo-European groups. While the Tarim mummies themselves left no written records, the linguistic evidence suggested continuity of population in the region, with the later Tocharian speakers possibly being descendants of the earlier communities. This linguistic connection was particularly intriguing because Tocharian occupied such an unusual position in the Indo-European family tree. It shared features with both Western and Eastern Indo-European languages, but didn't fit neatly into either group. This made sense if it represented an early branch that had split off from the main stem, carried east by migrating populations, and then evolved in isolation for centuries. Researchers also began paying more attention to the broader context of Bronze Age migrations. The Tarim Basin communities weren't isolated anomalies. They were part of a larger pattern of population movement across the Eurasian steppe during the Bronze Age, driven by climate changes, the adoption of horse domestication and wheeled vehicles, and probably good old-fashioned curiosity about what lay beyond the next horizon. The invention of the wheel and the domestication of horses had revolutionized transportation across the steppes, making long-distance travel feasible in ways it hadn't been before. People could move themselves, their families, and their possessions across vast distances. They could maintain herds of animals that grazed different areas seasonally. They could trade over much longer distances than had previously been possible. There was a period, brief in the grand scheme of things, when the Tarim mummies were primarily objects of scientific curiosity rather than political controversy. This window opened in the 1980s and lasted perhaps into the early 2000s, a time when archaeological discoveries could still be discussed somewhat apart from their modern political implications. During this period, exhibitions of the mummies travelled to museums in Europe and North America. The beauty of Lulun and her companions appeared in glass cases, carefully climate-controlled, often dramatically lit to emphasise the remarkable preservation. Museum visitors crowded around to see faces from 4,000 years ago, hair and skin and clothing that had survived when by all rights they should have crumbled to dust. The exhibitions tried to tell the story of life along the early Silk Road routes, emphasising the cultural exchange and technological sophistication of these ancient communities. They displayed the textiles, the baskets, the tools, and all the material evidence of a rich and complex culture. The labels describe the burial customs, the environmental conditions that enabled preservation, and the archaeological techniques used to recover and study the remains. For people who saw these exhibitions, the mummies were a window into a world they'd never learned about in school. Here were people who looked oddly familiar. The auburn hair, the felt hats that wouldn't seem out of place in a medieval European market, but who lived in a time and place that seemed impossibly distant. The cognitive dissonance was part of the appeal. Researchers during this period were able to conduct studies with relatively little interference. They could extract small samples for DNA analysis, could photograph and measure and catalogue without having to navigate complex political considerations. The work was still painstaking and still required careful negotiation with Chinese authorities who controlled access to the specimens, but it was possible. Some of the most important findings came from these studies. Researchers determined that the mummies showed no signs of violent death. These weren't victims of warfare or sacrifice. They were people who had died from disease, injury, old age, the normal hazards of life in the ancient world. The burial showed care and respect, suggesting that these communities valued their dead and wanted to send them off properly. Analysis of the stomach contents in some mummies revealed final meals, grains probably cooked into porridge or bread, sometimes with traces of meat. One mummy had apparently eaten dairy products shortly before death. These details brought the abstract past into sudden, intimate focus. These were people who had favourite foods, who had eaten meals prepared by family or community members, and who had experienced the simple comfort of a full belly. The textiles, subjected to increasingly sophisticated analysis, revealed dye recipes and weaving techniques that showed remarkable consistency across generations. Someone had learned how to create that particular shade of red from madder root, and had passed that knowledge to their children, who passed it to theirs. The continuity was visible in the fabrics, generations of weavers refining their craft, experimenting with patterns and maintaining standards of quality. Tool marks on the wooden coffins showed that the carpenters had used bronze implements, working with local woods that were strong enough to construct burial containers, but scarce enough that the wood had to be used carefully and efficiently. The joints were well made, the pieces fitted together with precision that suggested real carpentry skills, not just crude assembly. Some researchers focused on facial reconstruction, using the well-preserved skulls and modern techniques to approximate what the mummies might have looked like in life. The results were striking. Faces that could have belonged to contemporary Europeans or Central Asians, expressions that managed to convey personality, despite being based on bone structure and educated guesses about soft tissue. These reconstructions appeared in documentaries and magazine articles, helping to humanize the mummies, to make them feel less like archaeological specimens and more like actual people who had lived and died and been mourned. A woman with a slight smile, a man with a prominent nose and what looked like laugh lines around his eyes, a child, perhaps 3 years old, whose short life had ended for reasons now impossible to determine. The research also revealed that the communities had faced challenges. Skeletal analysis showed signs of nutritional stress, periods when food had been scarce enough to affect growth and bone development. Some individuals showed evidence of injuries that had healed, suggesting both that they'd survived accidents or violence, and that they'd received care afterward and time to recover. Probably help from community members who could support them while they healed. This was a picture of human life in all its complexity. Not noble savages living in harmony with nature, not brutal primitives struggling to survive. Just people dealing with the challenges of their environment, developing technologies and social structures that help them thrive, passing their knowledge to the next generation, and eventually dying and being buried with the hope that whatever came next would be better than what they'd left behind. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Tarim Basin communities was their position at the literal crossroads of different cultural spheres. The archaeological evidence showed influences from multiple directions, blending into something that was distinctly local but drew on broader traditions. The sheep breeds raised by these communities, for example, showed genetic connections to both Western and Eastern varieties. Someone had brought sheep originally domesticated in the Near East, but over generations of selective breeding in the local environment, these flocks had developed their own characteristics. The wool found in the textiles had particular qualities, fine enough for sophisticated weaving, durable enough for the harsh climate, that resulted from generations of careful breeding choices. The grain varieties tell a similar story. Wheat had originated in the Fertile Crescent and spread east through Iran and Central Asia. Millet came from China, domesticated by different cultures using different techniques. Finding both grains in Tarim Basin sites suggested that the communities there were in contact with agricultural traditions from both directions, adopting crops that worked in their environment regardless of where they originated. This practical eclecticism extended to technology as well. Bronzeworking techniques showed connections to both Western and Eastern metallurgical traditions. The people knew how to create the alloys they needed, probably through trade connections that brought in copper and tin from different regions. They made tools and weapons using techniques that would have been recognized by contemporary bronze workers in both the Middle East and China, but with their own local variations. The burial practice of using boat-shaped coffins is particularly interesting because it doesn't clearly connect to either Eastern or Western traditions. It seems to have been a local innovation, perhaps reflecting beliefs about death and the afterlife that were specific to the Tarim Basin communities. The boats weren't realistic vessels. They were symbolic, suggesting rather than reproducing, which implies sophisticated thinking about symbolism and ritual. Some researchers have suggested that the boat imagery might relate to the rivers that were crucial to life in the region. The Tarim Basin is one of the driest places on Earth, but it's crossed by rivers flowing down from the surrounding mountains. These rivers created ribbons of life through the desert, providing water for irrigation, fishing, and transportation. A boat carrying the dead might represent a journey along one of these life-giving waterways into whatever lay beyond. The mixing of cultural influences wasn't random or chaotic. The communities made deliberate choices about what to adopt and what to maintain from their own traditions. They used wheat and millet, but cooked them according to their own recipes. They wove textiles using Western techniques, but created patterns that were distinctly theirs. They worked bronze using knowledge from multiple sources, but made objects suited to their specific needs. This selective adoption suggests communities that were confident in their own identity, while being open to useful innovations from elsewhere. They weren't passive recipients of cultural influence from more powerful neighbours. They were active participants in networks of exchange, choosing what worked for them, adapting it to their circumstances, and probably contributing their own innovations to the broader pool of knowledge circulating across Central Asia. The position at the crossroads also meant exposure to ideas beyond material culture. Religious beliefs, philosophical concepts, stories and songs, and ways of understanding the world. All of these would have circulated along the same routes as physical goods. While we can't know exactly what the Tarim Basin communities believed, the care they showed in burial practices suggests sophisticated ideas about death, the soul, and the continuation of identity beyond physical life. For all that the Tarim Basin preserved remarkably well, we need to acknowledge what's missing from the archaeological record. The extreme dryness that mummified bodies also meant that these communities left behind only what could survive without water. Anything that required or attracted moisture decayed just like it would anywhere else. This means we have an excellent record of textiles and leather, of dried plant materials and wooden objects, of bone and stone and metal. We know what people wore, what tools they used, and what grains they ate. But we don't know their stories. We don't know their names. We don't know what they called themselves, or what they believed, or what songs they sang to their children. Writing, if they had it, didn't survive. The earliest written materials from the region date to much later, to the Buddhist manuscripts written in Tocharian and other languages during the first millennium CE. By that time, the original Tarim Basin communities had been gone for centuries. The cultural practices transformed or replaced by successive waves of new settlers and new influences. So we're left making inferences from physical evidence. which can tell us a lot, but not everything. We can see that they valued their dead enough to bury them carefully, but we can't know whether they believed in an afterlife or reincarnation or something else entirely. We can see that they created beautiful textiles, but we don't know if weaving had ritual significance or was purely utilitarian or perhaps both. The food offerings in the graves tell us they thought the dead might need sustenance, but not whether that was a literal belief or a symbolic gesture. The boat-shaped coffins suggest water-related symbolism, but we can only guess at the specific meanings attached to boats and journeys and rivers in their cosmology. This gap between what we can know and what we'd like to know is one of the fundamental frustrations of archaeology. The material remains are tantalizing hints at richer, more complex cultural lives that existed, but left no direct record. We're reconstructing a world from fragments, knowing that what we see is partial at best. Even the preservation bias affects what questions we can ask. We have excellent information about burial customs because graves survive, but we know almost nothing about how they celebrated births, or marriages, or successful harvests. Those rituals, if they existed, left no trace in the archaeological record. The settlements themselves have proven harder to find and excavate than the burials. People buried their dead in the driest parts of the desert, where preservation was best. They lived along rivers and in areas with enough moisture to support agriculture. Those areas are now either still inhabited, making excavation complicated, or have been so altered by centuries of agricultural activity and shifting river courses that the original settlement layers are difficult to identify. What this means is that our picture of these communities is skewed toward death rather than life. We know more about how they buried their dead than about how they lived. This is a common problem in archaeology, but it's particularly pronounced with the Tarim mummies, where the spectacular preservation of burials has overshadowed the less dramatic evidence of daily life. Still, we work with what we have. The textiles tell us about technological sophistication and aesthetic sensibility. The tools show practical problem-solving and accumulated knowledge. The bones reveal diet and health, and the challenges the people faced and sometimes overcame. The genetic evidence connects them to broader patterns of human migration and mixing. From these fragments, we build hypotheses. We test them against new evidence as it emerges. We revise our understanding when the data demands it. This is how archaeology works, slowly assembling a picture from scattered pieces, acknowledging that the picture will always be incomplete, but hoping that it becomes more accurate over time. The desert preserved what it could. The challenge for us is to read those preserved materials carefully, to extract every bit of information they contain, while acknowledging the limitations of what dry sand and time can tell us about human lives lived thousands of years ago. Despite decades of research, fundamental questions about the Tarim Basin communities remain open. We still don't know exactly when the first settlers arrived, though the evidence suggests sometime in the early Bronze Age, possibly around 2500 to 2000 BCE. We don't know what prompted the migration: climate change, population pressure in their original homelands, or the simple human drive to see what lies beyond the horizon. We don't know how large these communities were. Burial grounds contain dozens to hundreds of individuals, but we can't know if that represents the full population of a settlement or just those who died during the period when that particular burial ground was in use. The settlement sites that have been found suggest relatively small communities, perhaps a few dozen to a few hundred people, but that's based on limited excavation of sites that may have been occupied intermittently or for different purposes. The question of what happened to these communities is particularly vexing. By the early 1st millennium CE, the population of the Tarim Basin had changed. New groups had arrived, bringing different cultural practices, different burial customs, and different languages. The descendants of the Bronze Age settlers, if they remained in the region, had been absorbed into these new populations, their distinctive culture transformed or lost. Some researchers suggest that climate change played a role. The Tarim Basin has always been dry, but the degree of aridity has varied over millennia. If the rivers that sustained agriculture in the region became less reliable, communities might have been forced to move or to adopt different ways of life. Pastoralists can adapt to marginal changes in rainfall better than farmers can. A population that had practiced mixed agriculture might have shifted toward pure pastoralism, becoming more mobile, leaving less archaeological trace. Others point to the expansion of various empires and trading networks. As the Silk Road became more formalized, as powerful states in both China and Central Asia started taking interest in controlling trade routes, the smaller independent communities of the Tarim Basin might have been absorbed, displaced, or transformed by these larger political forces. Being at the crossroads became less advantageous when the crossroads became contested territory. The genetic studies have added new layers to these questions. The DNA of modern populations in the region shows that they're descended from multiple waves of migration and mixing, with contributions from East Asian, Central Asian and Western Eurasian populations. The Bronze Age Tarim communities are part of this mix, but they're not the whole story. Their genetic legacy persists but is heavily blended with other groups that arrived later. This raises questions about cultural transmission and identity. When does a population change enough that we can no longer say it's the same culture? If the descendants of the Bronze Age communities adopted new languages, new religions, new burial customs, and new technologies, are they still the same people? Or have they become something else? Archaeology tends to define cultures by their material remains, which means that changes in pottery styles or burial practices can mark the transition from one culture to another in the archaeological record. But people don't experience culture as pottery styles. They experience it as language, belief, practice, and identity. Those things can persist even when material culture changes, or they can disappear even when material culture shows continuity. The Tarim mummies force us to think about these questions because they represent communities that were culturally distinct but not isolated, maintaining traditions that connected them to distant homelands while adapting to a new environment and incorporating influences from neighbours in all directions. They were neither pure representatives of a Western culture transported east, nor fully assimilated into Eastern cultural spheres. They were something in between, something hybrid, something that defies easy categorization, and that, perhaps, is the most important lesson they offer. Human cultures don't exist in neat, bounded categories. They bleed into each other, borrow from each other, and transform in response to new circumstances while maintaining threads of continuity with the past. The Tarim Basin communities were doing 4,000 years ago what humans have always done: adapting, innovating, maintaining some traditions while adopting new ones, and building lives in the circumstances they found themselves in. You might be wondering why any of this matters. These were small communities in a remote region, gone for thousands of years, leaving behind mummified remains and some well-preserved textiles. Why should we care about their story? The answer, I think, has several layers. On the most basic level, these mummies are a remarkable window into human life in the Bronze Age. The preservation is so exceptional that we can see details usually lost to time. We can examine the weave of fabrics, the construction of boots, and even the food in their stomachs. Every mummy is a time capsule, offering insights into an era that otherwise exists mainly in fragments and guesswork. But beyond that, the Tarim mummies challenge our assumptions about how human history worked. The standard narrative of distinct civilizations developing in isolation and only later coming into contact doesn't hold up when you pull auburn-haired mummies from the deserts of Central Asia. The Bronze Age was more connected, more cosmopolitan, and more complex than we typically imagine. This matters for how we understand our own world. The idea that cultures develop in isolation and that mixing or migration is somehow abnormal doesn't match the archaeological evidence. Humans have always moved, always mixed, and always borrowed ideas and technologies from each other. The Tarim Basin communities are just one example of this broader pattern, but they're a striking one precisely because they're so unexpected. The mummies also remind us that the past is more diverse than our simplified versions of it suggest. Not every Bronze Age community looked the same, practiced the same customs, or followed the same trajectory. There was room for experimentation, for local variation, and for communities that combined influences from multiple sources into something unique. There's also something humbling about archaeological discoveries that challenge existing narratives. They remind us that we don't know everything, that our understanding of the past is always provisional, always subject to revision when new evidence emerges. The textbooks that left out the Tarim mummies weren't lying. They were working with incomplete information and making choices about what to include in limited space. But their omissions left gaps in our collective understanding, gaps that new research is only now filling in. The story of the Tarim mummies is also a story about scientific progress. The techniques that finally allowed researchers to understand these communities, DNA analysis, isotope studies, and advanced textile analysis, didn't exist when the mummies were first discovered. The questions we can ask now are different from the questions researchers could ask 50 or 100 years ago. This suggests that there's more still to learn, more questions we'll be able to ask as techniques continue to improve. Perhaps most importantly, the Tarim mummies belong to a part of the world that has often been overlooked in Western narratives about history. Central Asia appears in those narratives mainly when it intersects with European or East Asian history, as a route for invaders or traders, but rarely as a place with its own significant cultural developments. The mummies force recognition that Central Asia has a deep history, that communities there were doing interesting things long before they showed up in anyone else's historical records. This shift in perspective, from seeing Central Asia as a blank space on the map to recognizing it as a region with its own rich history, is overdue. It doesn't diminish the achievements of other regions. It adds complexity to our picture of human development, showing that innovation and adaptation were happening in many places simultaneously, and that the threads of human history run in more directions than simple east-west or north-south narratives suggest. The Tarim Basin keeps giving up its secrets slowly and reluctantly in the careful hands of archaeologists working with brushes and shovels and increasingly sophisticated laboratory techniques. Each new excavation reveals more burials, more textiles, and more evidence of lives lived along the margins of the desert 4,000 years ago. The mummies themselves rest now in climate-controlled museum cases, far from the sand that preserved them. Their faces, dried but intact, look out at museum visitors with expressions impossible to read. Are they serene, surprised, simply neutral, the way faces become when muscle tension is replaced by desiccation? We project our interpretations onto them, as humans have always projected interpretations onto the dead. But beyond the projections and interpretations, beyond the debates about what they mean for modern politics or ethnic identities, the mummies are fundamentally just evidence of human persistence. People saw a difficult landscape and found ways to thrive in it. They developed technologies suited to their environment. They raised children and buried their dead and wove beautiful fabrics in the brief spans of time allotted to them. They weren't trying to become mysteries for future archaeologists to puzzle over. They were just living their lives, doing the best they could with the knowledge and resources available to them, probably never imagining that thousands of years later, people would examine their clothing and analyze their DNA and argue about what their presence in the Tarim Basin means. The desert preserved them not because they were important, but because the conditions were right. The dry air, the salt, and the stable temperature underground, these didn't care about preserving history. They just happened to create an environment where organic materials didn't decay, where bodies mummified instead of rotting, and where time stopped its usual work of returning everything to dust. What we do with that preservation is up to us. We can study the evidence carefully, build our hypotheses tentatively, and revise our understanding when new data demands it. We can acknowledge what we don't know while working to fill in the gaps. We can resist the temptation to make the past simpler or more dramatic than it actually was. The truth, as far as we can determine it from mummies and textiles and ancient seeds, is that the Tarim Basin was home to communities that blended influences from multiple regions. that adapted successfully to a harsh environment and that maintained their cultural identity while remaining open to innovation. They were neither purely Western nor purely Eastern, neither primitive nor highly civilized by the standards we typically apply to Bronze Age cultures. They were just people, navigating the challenges of their time and place. Their story didn't make it into the textbooks because it complicated narratives that depended on clear categories and simple timelines. But complication, it turns out, is close to the truth than simplification. The past was messy, diverse, and full of exceptions to every rule we try to impose on it. The Tarim mummies are one of those exceptions, and their presence in the archaeological record enriches our understanding of how human cultures have always worked. So the next time you see a map of the Silk Road, with its neat lines connecting east and west, remember that those routes crossed lands where people had been living for thousands of years, where communities had developed their own cultures long before the great trade networks formalised. Remember the mummies in their boat-shaped coffins wrapped in plaids and felt, buried with baskets and combs and offerings of grain. Remember that history is bigger and stranger, and more interesting than any textbook can capture. That every blank space on the map probably isn't as blank as it appears, and that the desert keeps secrets that archaeology only slowly reveals. And remember that those secrets, when finally uncovered, usually show us that human beings have always been more adaptable, more innovative, and more capable of thriving in unexpected places than we give them credit for. This sand covers, and the sand reveals, in its own time, at its own pace. We're just visitors here, trying to read stories written in bones and textiles, in genetic markers and burial customs, piecing together lives from fragments and hoping we get close to the truth. The Tarim mummies can't correct our mistakes or fill in the gaps we miss. They can only lie there, patient and preserved, waiting for us to ask better questions, to look more carefully, to see them not as mysteries or controversies, but as what they actually were. People who lived and died in a place that remembered them when everywhere else forgot.